Residents of Bonbon Palace. Flat 1 Musa, Mariam and Mohammed. Flat 2 Sadar and Gaba. Flat 3 Hairdressers Semal and Seelal. Flat 4 the Firenaturedsons. Flat 5 Haji, his son, daughter and grandchildren. Flat 6 Metin Chetansevas and his wife Nadia. Flat 7 Me. Flat 8 the Blue Mistress. Flat 9 Hygiene Tijin and Sue. Flat 10 Madam Auntie. People say I have a fanciful mind, probably the most tactful way ever invented of saying you're talking nonsense. They might be right. Whenever I get anxious and mess up what I have to say, I'm scared of people stares and pretend not to be so, introduce myself to strangers and feign ignorance about how estranged I am from myself, feel hurt by the past, and find it hard to admit the future won't be any better, or fail to come to terms with either where or who I am, at any one of these all too frequently recurring moments. I know I don't make much sense, but nonsense is just as far removed from deception as truth. Deception turns truth inside out. As for nonsense, it solders deception and truth one to the other so much so as to make them indistinguishable. Though this might seem complicated, it's actually very simple. So simple that it can be expressed by a single line. Let's presume truth is a horizontal line. Then, what we call deception becomes a vertical one. As for nonsense, here's what it looks like. With neither an end nor a beginning to its trajectory, the circle recognizes no horizontal or vertical axis. You can plunge into the circle from anywhere you want, as long as you do not confuse that point with a beginning. No start points, no thresholds, no endings. No matter at which instant or with what particular incident I make the first move, there will always be a time preceding that start of mine. Always a past ahead of every past and hence never a veritable outset. I never saw it myself but heard from someone wise enough, that back in the old days, when the garbage cans on the streets of Istanbul had round lids of grayish aluminum, there was a game that local boys and girls played together. A certain number of people had to join in, few enough not to crowd, large enough to entertain, just the right amount and always an even number. First in the garbage game came the question when? For an answer. For different segments would be chalked on the round lid with a separate word corresponding to each direction, right now, tomorrow, soon, never. The lid would then be spun from its handle in the middle as swiftly as possible, and before it found a chance to slow down, the person in line would stop it with the touch of a finger. The same would then be repeated, one by one for all the participants of the game, so that each one could fathom which time frame he or she stood closest to. In the second round, 4 separate responses would be written down as possible answers to the question to whom? To me, to the one I love, to my best friend, to all of us. Once again the lid would be given a spin and once again the players would reach out to stop its delirious circumvolution. The third round was intended to find an answer to the question what? For auspicious and for ominous words were marked on the remaining 8 spaces, always equal in number, to add a dash of fairness to the whims of fate, love, marriage, happiness, wealth, sickness, separation, accident, death. The lid would turn once again with the answers now building up so the players could finally reach the long-awaited response to the question, what will happen to whom and when? To me, wealth, soon, to the one I love. Happiness, tomorrow, to my best friend, marriage, right away, or to all of us, separation, never. Starting the ball of narration rolling is not hard. I too can employ the logic of the garbage game with some minor adjustments here and there. First of all, one needs to find the time frame of the narration, yesterday, today, tomorrow, infinity. Then, the places should be designated, where I came from, where I stand now, where I am headed, nowhere. Next, it would Be the player's turn to assign the subject of the act, I, one among us, all of us, none of us. Finally, without upsetting the 4-to-4 balance, one needs to line up the possible outcomes. In this manner, if I spin an imaginary garbage lid 4 times in a row, I should be able to construct a decent sentence. What more than a sentence does one need to start off a story that has no start to it anyway? In the spring of 2002, in Istanbul, one among us died before the time was up and the line closed into a complete circle. On Wednesday, May 1, 2002, at 12:20 p.m. A white van, in need of a wash, and decorated with the picture of a huge rat with needle-sharp teeth on one side, a hairy humongous spider on the other, failing to take notice of the barriers ahead, found itself in the middle of a crowd of 2,200 people. Among these, about 500 were there to commemorate Workers' May Day, 1,300 were policemen ordered to prevent the latter from doing so, a number of others were state officials there to celebrate the day as a spring holiday by wreathing Ataturk's statue, and all the rest were elementary school children, made to fill up the empty spaces, waving the Turkish flags handed out by now, these children had almost broken into hives from standing under the sun for hours on end listening to the humming of dreary speeches. Incidentally, a good number of these had learnt only recently how to read and write, and with that impetus kept shouting out the syllables of every single written word they spotted around. When the ratty, spidery van plowed into the crowd, these kids were the ones who yelled out in unison, "Rainbow pest remove AL service, call us and we will remove them for you." The driver of the van, a ginger-haired, flap-eared, funny-looking, baby-faced man with features so exaggerated that he hardly looked real, lost his cool when faced with this onslaught. On steering the van in the opposite direction to escape the wrath of the children, he found himself in the middle of a highly agitated circle of demonstrators surrounded by an outer circle of even more agitated policemen. During the few minutes when the driver was paralyzed into inaction, he was alternately either booed with glee or stoned in anger by demonstrators sharing the same ideology yet apparently interpreting it differently, steering his van toward the other half of the circle. In a desperate move only helped the driver get held up once again, this time by the police. He would have most probably been arrested at once, and things would have conceivably taken a worse turn for the others as well, had the police not darted, at exactly the same moment, toward a tiny, impetuous group determined to start the march right away. The van driver was drenched in sweat when he finally succeeded in getting out of the tumultuous square. His name was Injustice Pure Turk. He had been in the pest removal business for almost 33 years and had never hated his job as fervently as he did that day. In order not to get himself into trouble once again, he shunned the shortcuts and made his way through the winding roads, only to arrive a full hour and 45 minutes late for his appointment at the apartment building he had been searching. Shaking off his trauma bit by bit, he parked along the sidewalk while staring suspiciously at the cluster of people blocking the entrance of the building. Having no idea why they had gathered there, but nevertheless convinced they would do him no harm, he managed to calm down and again check the address his chatty secretary had handed to him. That very morning, Cabal Street, number 88, Bonbon Palace. His chatterbox of a secretary had also included a note, the apartment building, with the rose acacia tree in the garden. Wiping away the large beads of sweat on his forehead, Injustice Pure Turk stared at the tree in the garden that was in bloom with mauve, reddish-pink flowers. This, he thought, must be what they called rose acacia. Still, since he did not at all trust his secretary whom he intended to replace, at the next possible instance, he personally wanted to see the building's signpost with his own short-sighted eyes. Parking the van askew, he jumped down No sooner had he taken a step, however, than a small girl among a group of 3 children standing in the crowd screamed in horror, "The genie is here! Grandpa, Grandpa, look, the genie is here!" The round, graying, bearded elderly man the girl was tugging turned around and inspected first the van and then the van's driver, each time with an equally disappointed look. Evidently dissatisfied with what he saw, he screwed up his face so that it looked even more sour and drew the 3 children closer to him. Injustice was done to Injustice Pure Turk. He was not a genie or anything, but just an ordinary man who possessed a disproportionate face with somewhat mammoth ears and unfortunately colored hair. He also happened to be short. Indeed very short, 1 meter and 43 centimeters in all. Even though he had been previously taken for a dwarf, this was the first time he was accused of being a genie. Trying not to mind, he doggedly pushed his way through the group toward the ashen apartment building. He donned the thin-framed, thick-lensed glasses he habitually carried, not on his nose as the doctor had recommended but inside the pocket of his work overalls. Despite the help of the glasses, he still could not make out what the messy protrusion at the front of the building was until it was an inch away, a relief of a peacock with the feathers darkened with dirt. Had it been cleaned up, it might have looked appealing to the eye. Underneath the relief it read, Bonbon Palace number 88. He was at the right place. A business card squeezed in between the lined-up buzzers next to the door drew his attention. It belonged to a rival firm that had 2 months previously started to work in the same neighborhood. Since the people around no longer seemed to be paying any attention to him, he took the opportunity to remove the business card and put one of his own in its stead. Upon having these business cards printed, he had hired a university student to distribute them all around the neighborhood, but it had not taken him long to fire the young man without pay for doing a lousy job. That was typical of Injustice Pure Turk. He never trusted anyone. To unload the pesticide sprays, he walked back to his van. Yet, the moment he had shut his door, a blonde woman with a hairdresser's smock tied around her neck reached in through the half-open window and gawked at him cross-eyed. "Is this van all you've got?" "Won't be enough, I tell you," she hooted, knitting her well-plucked eyebrows. "They'd promised at least 2 trucks. There's so much trash, even 2 trucks would have a hard time." "I'm not here to pick up your garbage," Injustice Pure Turk frowned. "I'm here for the insects. The cockroaches." "Oh," the woman flinched. "Even then, I tell you, what you've got won't be enough." Before Injustice Pure Turk could fathom what she was talking about and what exactly these people had been waiting for, 2 red trucks plowed onto Cabal Street as if they had heard the call. The crowd stirred upon noticing a van from a television channel right behind the trucks. Injustice Pure Turk, utterly unaware of the excitement around him, was trying at that moment to find a better spot to park. However, finding himself amidst chaos upon chaos against his will must have somewhat tattered his nerves by now, for the vein on the right side of his forehead started to thump at a crazy pace. The single movement he made to press down on the vein was more than enough to make him lose control of the steering wheel. Trying to back up in a panic, he rammed into the piles of bags slung next to the garden wall separating the apartment building from the street. All the garbage inside the bags was scattered onto the sidewalk. If truth be told, Bonbon Palace was used to garbage, having struggled with it for quite some time now. From early February to mid-April, the period following the bankruptcy of the private company collecting the garbage in the area and preceding the resumption of service by a new one, a considerable garbage hill had collected here, bringing along with it an increasingly putrid smell. Things had not much improved with the new company either. In spite of the regular nightly collection, Both the Cabal Street residents and passers-by kept throwing garbage next to the garden wall, thereby managing to collectively raise a garbage hill up anew every day. If interested, you can go there even today to see with your own eyes how. Along the wall separating the apartment's garden from the street, the garbage hill leveled by dusk rises anew the following day with no ultimate loss to its mass. Garbage bags are thrown away, garbage bags are then picked up, but despite the continual rise and fall, it is as if the garbage hill keeps perpetuating its presence. The hill comes with its own hill people, seekers, who show up daily to collect pieces of tin, cardboard, leftover food, and the like, as well as an army of cats and crows and seagulls. Then, of course, there are bugs, for wherever there is garbage, there are also bugs. Lice, too, have taken over in Bonbon Palace. And trust me on this, lice are the very worst. In order to observe this, one needs to spend some time there. If you have no time, however, you'll have to make do with my version of the story. Yet I can only speak for myself. Not that I'll foist my own views onto what transpires. But I might, here and there, solder the horizontal line of truth to the vertical line of deception in order to escape the wearisome humdrum reality of where I am anchored right now. After all, I am bored stiff here. If someone brought me the good news that my life would be less dreary tomorrow, I might feel less bored today. Yet, I know too well that tomorrow will be just the same. And so will all the days to follow. Nevertheless, with my fondness for circles, I should not give you the impression that it is only my life that persistently repeats itself. In the final instance, the vertical is just as faithful to its recurrence as the horizontal. Contrary to what many presume, that which is called eternal recurrence is germane not only to circles but also to lines and linear arrangements. From the monotony of lines there deviates only one path, drawing circles. Within circles, spiraling in and in. Such deviation resembles, in a way, being a spoilsport in the garbage game, not abiding by what comes up when you spin the round lid of grayish aluminum, spoiling the game by not waiting for your turn, craving to spin again and again, messing around with subjects, objects, verbs and coincidences while comforting yourself throughout. In Istanbul in the spring of 2002, the death of one among us was caused by herself, me, us all, none of us. On Wednesday, May 1st, 2002, Injustice Pure Turk applied pesticide dust to one of the flats of Bonbon Palace. 15 days later, upon returning for the baby cockroaches born from their dead mother's eggs, he found the door of that particular flat deadlocked. However, it is too soon to talk about these things right now. For there had been another time preceding this moment and, of course, one before that as well. Before, there were once two ancient cemeteries in this neighborhood, one small, almost rectangular and well-kept, the other huge, semi-lunar and visibly neglected. Surrounded by ivy-covered fences and shadowy hills, leaning onto the same disheveled wall, they had spread out over a wide terrain, jointly and continuously. Both were crowded to the brim, yet deserted to the extreme. The small one belonged to the Armenians and the large one to the Muslims. On the 6-foot wall separating the two cemeteries, rusty nails, jagged fragments of glass and, in spite of the fear of bad luck, broken mirror pieces had been scattered upright to prevent people trespassing from one to the other. As for the two-paneled, iron-grilled, gargantuan doors of each cemetery, they were located exactly on opposite ends, one facing north and the other south, so that if a visitor perchance harbored any inclination to cross from one to the other, he would be discouraged by the length of the road he would have to walk. Just the same, no one actually had to put up with such an inconvenience, since there had never been a visitor with a relative buried in one cemetery who wished, once there, to pay a visit to the other cemetery as well. Be that as it may, there was many a being that hopped and jumped from one cemetery to the other as they pleased, be it night or day, the wind and thieves, for instance, or the cats and lizards. They had all mastered the many ways of going through, over and under the barrier separating the two cemeteries. That would not last long. An incessant wave of migrations cluttered up the city with buildings marshaled in tandem like the soldiers of a sinister army, each and every one looking much alike from a distance. Amidst the muddled waters of citification surrounding them in all directions, the cemeteries remained intact like two uninhabited islands. As new high-rises and rows of houses were built continuously, around them up popped small, sporadic, circumscribed streets resembling from far above the veins of a brain. Streets cut in front of houses and houses blocked streets, the whole neighborhood swelled, bloating like a foolhardy fish unable to feel satiated even when beyond being full. Finally, when just about to burst, it became inevitable that an incision must be made and an opening created on the stretched tight node, so as to relieve the pressure mounting from within. That incision in turn meant a new road had to be built before too long. Due to this unforeseen, unstoppable growth, all the streets in the vicinity had become wedged at the edges like water with nowhere to go. And avenue, by linking them all into a single channel, could make them reflow. Yet, when the time came for the authorities to take a bird's-eye view to decide where and how to build this avenue, they realized an onerous quandary awaited them. At all the possible sites where such an avenue could be constructed, there was, as if by design, either a government building or the property of the local gentry, and if not those, the jam-packed low-income shanty houses that could be effortlessly taken down one by one but were not that easy to erase when there were so many. In order to be able to build the road that would open the way, they would first have to open the way for a road. Istanbul being a city where houses were not built in accordance with road plans but road plans made so as not to upset the location of the houses, the construction of the new road required tearing down as few houses as possible. Given this precondition, there remained only one option, making the road pass through the hilly terrain of the two cemeteries. Once the reports detailing this plan had been approved by the authorities, it was decided that within 2.5 months the two cemeteries should be removed and the hilly terrain flattened out. Those who had loved ones in these cemeteries need not worry, they said. After all, the tombs could be moved in their entirety to various spots around the city. Muslim tombs could be transported to the slopes overlooking the Golden Horn, for instance, and the non-Muslims to their own graveyards in various other quarters. Most of the tombs were so ancient that along with their occupants, their descendants had also changed worlds by now. There were also those that, despite having descendants still above the ground, might yet go unclaimed. In spite of all this, the number of people snooping into the fate of the tombs turned out to be far more than the authorities had initially expected. Among them, some relatives simply wanted their dead to be left alone, while others discovered the proposed alternate graveyards were already crammed full. Both of these groups had instantly started to search for ways to reverse the decision. Still, the majority of the relatives acquiesced to do whatever was deemed necessary, and to this end set off to shoulder the burden. In the following days, the Muslim cemetery played host at all hours of the day to all kinds of visitors, each singing a different tune. The task of hiding the traces of the nocturnal visitors from those paying homage in the daytime fell upon the cemetery guards, who at dawn gathered the spilled bones and closed over the tombs dug up during the night. Then, towards noon, the authorities showed up to inspect the guards, and in the afternoon, families worried about their dead getting mixed up with other people's dropped by in large crowds, all the while talking and complaining, if not to the tombstones, to one another. until the cemetery was officially forbidden to accept visitors. The old and middle-aged women of these families were there almost every single day. When tired of standing up, they would line up with their blankets spread right there around their relatives' tombs. Once seated, they would either weep alone or pray together, clutching their children tightly to force them into reverential silence. Then time would drift by, the air getting heavier. Some children would fall asleep while others escaped to play, and a cloud of languor would daintily follow, forming a canopy over the women on the ground. The descent of the spiritual, this can be called. After all, even the most otherworldly cannot remain oblivious to the forces of gravity pulling them down to earth. In this state, the women would make it through to the night, rooting about in their long tattered bags, bought who knows when and mutated over time into the same grimy tone of brown. They would fish out aniseed crackers, pour tea from thermoses while at the same time circulating lemon cologne to wipe both their sweaty faces and the reddish skin marks around their knees left by knee-high nylon socks that, no matter which size you chose, were always too tight. Next they would peruse the pages of the notebooks of the past, recalling one by one the names of all those who had made life living hell for the dearly departed. Once they started to hammer out past controversies, it would not take them long to abandon the mourning of the dead and switch instead to gossiping about the living. All tea gone and only a handful of aniseeds left from the crackers, one among them would remind the others of how the dearly departed, as if not having suffered enough on earth, were now denied peace even deep down under the ground. With that reminder, the gloom of the setting would engulf the cloud of languor. The ascent of the material, this can be called. After all, even the most worldly cannot remain indifferent to the celestial. Thus, these old and middle-aged women would step by step wander off from prayers to curses, from curses to gossip, only to retread to the beginning to wrap up this undulating conversation in a final prayer. As they retread, they would start searching for the children spread among the tombstones recklessly roaming the cemetery. The children would be sought, collared and dragged back to the gravestone of their relative for a last supplication. By then, the men would also have returned to the same spot, dog-tired from struggling all day long in vain to speak up to the deaf ears of bureaucracy, having acquired all in all a few fragments of documents and the map to the new burial ground, but still not a wee bit of clarification about where their dead would be buried within it. Pretending everything to be under control and within their purview, the aforesaid males would austerely confront each and every galling question and gloomy interpretation that their mothers, younger sisters, wives, mothers-in-law, older sisters, aunts, sisters-in-law and daughters put to them. While blankets were gathered and tombstones bid farewell to, several women would notice the many inconsistencies in the men's responses and ask either new questions or reformulate the old ones, only more persistently this time. With that final touch, the men's nerves, which were stretched tight as bow strings by the gears of bureaucracy, would snap, with them yelling at their wives and their wives yelling back at them. Families would leave the Muslim cemetery in utter chaos and without having resolved anything. Then night would descend, the two-paneled, iron-grilled, gargantuan door would close down, and thus the hours of the cats and tomb thieves would commence. As for the Armenian Orthodox cemetery, it too had plenty of visitors around the same time. With one difference, the majority of these visitors were there not to transport their tombs but rather to say their final goodbyes. Even if able to procure the necessary permit to transport, in what burial ground among the Orthodox cemeteries of Istanbul, long diminished with loss and shrunk through constriction, could they have buried their dead? Some prominent families and church members managed to move a number of graves, but that was all. Among the dead left behind there were cherished ancestors of eminent families, as well as those long unclaimed or recently abandoned, those whose grandchildren had scattered to four corners of the world, and those whose families still lived in Istanbul, those who had remained all their lives utterly faithful to their religion and loyal to their state, as well as those who refused to recognize either God or a state. For that is how things are. It is not their quantitative scarcity vis-a-vis the majority that makes minorities hapless, but rather their qualitative similarity. As a member of a minority group, you can be as industrious as an ant, even hit the jackpot and acquire a considerable fortune, but someday, just because you presently and will always belong to the same community, you could in an instant find yourself on a par with those of your community who have idled their lives away since birth. That is why the affluent among the minorities are never affluent enough, neither are their exceptional members ever sufficiently so. In the Turkey of the 1950s in particular, the moment a rich Muslim bumped into a poor one, what he would see on the latter's face would be someone so very unlike him, whereas a rich minority member running into a poor one would encounter on the latter's face someone so very unlike him, and yet treated alike. Accordingly, the same misery might awaken compassion in the rich Muslim who has the comfort of knowing that he will never sink to that position, whereas for a member of the rich minority it might easily trigger angst, with the unease of foreseeing that he too might unexpectedly end up there. Once a person starts to fear injustice, however, he can end up missing the real target and mix the results up with the causes. Hence, while the gentry of the Muslim majority may demonstrate a tender mercy toward the miserable in particular and to misery in general, the cream of the minority will approach the materially and spiritually downtrodden of their own community with chilled unease. All these nominal distinctions go no further, however. At the end of the 2.5-month period, only a sprinkle of tombs were transported from the Orthodox Armenian cemetery. The majority of the minority had thus remained behind. As for the Muslim cemetery, far more tombs had been transported, the minority of the majority was left behind. These two clusters of dead, with not an iota in common regarding family trees, upbringing or profiles, nevertheless concluded the very last stage of their presence in Istanbul alike one could bestow upon them a common rank, those unable to depart. The worst part of being one of those incapable of leaving a territory is less their inability to depart than their inability to reside. It was at precisely this stage that a twist of fate occurred. Way ahead of the bulldozers, thieves looted the tombstones, dogs embezzled the bones of a number of those unable to depart. Among some couples long buried together, due to name similarities or the negligence of cemetery officials. Incapable of deciphering the Ottoman script on the old tombstones, one ended up in one corner and the other at another. Some of the dead got mixed up and landed in different tombs, while a large majority were done away with silently, stealthily, systematically. Yet ultimately, it was simply fate that would determine the destiny of many of those unable to depart. Once these procedures came to an end, all that was left of that vast land was a field replete with holes, as if fallen prey to a horde of moles. When the time arrived to level the ground in its entirety, however, the authorities would be startled to discover two tombs had fortuitously remained intact. Their stone sarcophagi were made of crimson-veined white marble, decorated with sintamani and plant motifs germinating into 3 wheels of fate, their turbans almost as big as cartwheels, the distance from the base of their tombstones to the headstones measuring approximately 146 centimeters in height, surrounded with railings as sharp as arrows, and painted a green the color of raw leaves. While both were in the Muslim cemetery, one of the tombs was located at the southern slope and the other at the northern edge, at the bottom of the wall separating the Orthodox Armenian cemetery. This detail aside, they were exactly alike. on the outside surface of the accompanying stone. Both had hyacinth and tulip motifs. Exactly the same turban on their heads, the same sharply pointed arch around their seats, the same heading, Alabias Bakia Hawas, in Ottoman Selçuklu's asterisk script on their tomb inscriptions. Odd as it was, next to each one rested a rusted sign, probably posted at the same time by the same people: "Here lies Saint Hugo Pakadupendleft, who performed countless heroic deeds for the conquest of Islam while serving in the army of Abu Hafs Haddad, and who reached God's mercy before witnessing the fall of the infidel city. A prayer to his soul." When ordered to remove these two sarcophagi, the worker on the bulldozer had to leave work early with an awful pain in his groin. Though the pain had abated by the following day, he refused to drive the bulldozer all the same. On the third day, instead of the worker, his grandfather, who had no teeth in his mouth and no might in his muscles but ample oomph when it came to words, turned up instead. He narrated to whomever he came across spine-tingling stories about the dire fate of those hapless souls who had attempted to plunder the tombs of saints. By the morning of the fourth night, not a single worker was willing to drive the bulldozer. If truth be told, no one except them seemed much interested in Saint Hugo Pakadupendleft, and things would have remained so had the authorities not taken a sudden interest in the topic, upon being warned that their political opponents might use the current state of affairs against them. The year was 1949 and the political balance extremely fragile. Both the newly burgeoning opposition as well as the government itself constantly tainted one another with the brush of alleged insolence toward religion. It was at this point that the three consultant buddies showed up. The first of the three consultant buddies came up with the idea that in order not to disturb the saints' tombs, the avenue should take two separate twists at 2 points. His suggestion might have been considered had it not been the case that no one took him seriously, not since that ominous day when he had been given a ruthless tongue-lashing at his workplace by his wife, upon her discovery that he'd spent their entire month's rent at a nightclub. The second of the three consultant buddies, in turn, proposed the avenue continue in a straight line, right up to the two tombs, where it would bifurcate like a piece of string cheese. Though everyone knew he managed, albeit with difficulty, to gain the upper hand over his wife, even dared raise his voice at home and smash unsavory food against the wall, his idea was not accepted as no one wanted to take responsibility for possible future traffic accidents. It was then that the third of the three consultant buddies asserted in a meandering speech that they were committing a grave error by rushing to a solution. First they had to grasp what exactly the problem was and, had they done so, would indeed detect more than one peculiarity in this particular case. Thus he paraphrased his oration: first diagnosis, then treatment. The points of emphasis the third of the three consultant buddies wanted clarified for diagnosis were as follows. 1. What exactly was this army of Abu Hafs Haddad? What was it doing in Istanbul? 2. If this army was one of those Arab forces that had long ago come as far as Istanbul with the intent of conquest, what was someone like Saint Hugo Pakadupendleft, whose name did not at all sound Arabic, doing among them? 3. If Saint Hugo Pakadupendleft had indeed been martyred while fighting for the conquest of Istanbul on the side of the Arabs, why on earth did he have two tombs? 4. Last but not least, which of the tombs was genuine? Meticulously elaborating each point on his agenda, the third of the three consultant buddies arrived at the conclusion that though there was no harm in skipping some of these points so as to save time, it was absolutely essential to clarify the last detail to ascertain which of the two tombs was the real one. Indeed, he was a better orator than the others and a bachelor to boot. Be that as it may, digging a saint's tomb at a time like this was analogous to accepting a gift package with unknown content from an anonymous sender. It probably did not contain anything harmful, but what if it did? Just to make matters worse, right at this time, a foul-mouthed journalist notorious for stirring bread into his rack for breakfast but nonetheless alert enough to have his ear to the ground, had already picked up the scent and written a piece in the leading opposition newspaper entitled, "Government's Gravediggers in Business Suits." Though the editorial itself was not as accusatory as its title hinted and the claim behind it rather hazy, these could be due more to the journalists having passed out before finishing the piece than to his concern not to further poke his nose into this business. There was no way to tell that. Once he sobered up, he would not write another editorial, this time even more aggressive. Still, the tombs were dug up all at once and without any prior notice. Set to accomplish this unpleasant duty in the fastest way possible and without any onlookers present, 2 officials, 3 guards and 5 workers gathered with their briefcases, flashlights, pickaxes and shovels before dawn. They dug up the tombs of the saints under the stunned looks of a few vagabonds who had settled in the vacated cemetery once the thieves and street dogs had stopped coming. Nothing came out of the first tomb, neither a coffin, nor a shroud, nor bones or a skull, nor the personal belongings of the saint. At least there were tree roots, cracked rocks and worms, even these were missing in the second tomb. It was at this point that the authorities committed the fatal mistake of supposing the problem had thus been solved. With too much sanguinity, they removed the stone sarcophagi and took down the surrounding railing. The following day, an unsigned editorial appeared in the leading opposition newspaper with the title, "Government's Three-Piece Suited Assassins of Saints," only this time the beginning and the end of the piece had been connected into a meaningful whole. It contended that the government, which had hitherto demonstrated at every opportunity what little respect it had for the Ottoman cultural heritage, had now taken upon itself to one by one raze to the ground all the saints' tombs in Istanbul, that some politicians who feigned in public to uphold customs and tradition secretly belittled everything about the populace, that the faith bursting from within the nation was sacrificed for the sake of an abstract Western model, and that in the name of cleansing religion of superstition Islam was altogether opposed. Towards the end, an open call was placed to all Muslims to safeguard their saints. Despite the fact that the piece did not lead, as feared, to an upsurge of emotions, still like a signal rocket it triggered into action all sorts of individuals and organizations all around the country. It was as if all these people had suddenly assumed the discovery of what had happened to the 2 saints' tombs in the vacated cemetery as their sole purpose in life, demanding an explanation from the authorities. The issue was not only extremely sensitive but also remarkably exploitable. The discussants started with the negligence of modernization and concluded with a suggestion that instead, modernization itself be neglected. Like a diving beetle that skids on water, they hopped and skipped on ostentatious notions, such as the oblivion of the nation, contemporary beruses, enforced westernization, sinister secularization and so forth, thereby traversing a whole lake of antagonisms, splashing water around all but themselves. A local newspaper that came out in the provinces but happened to be particularly interested in what was going on in Istanbul even though it had no distribution there, thus declared, "What is termed westernization is nothing but a loving marriage between the East and the West." Yet, one should never forget that in this matrimony the West is the woman and East the man. The latter is therefore naturally the head of the household. For that reason it should be those swanky streets built for a few overindulged ladies to gallivant on and for dressed-up dandies to show off their cars that show respect to the saints, not the other way around. With the detection of a crime necessitating the disclosure of the criminal, the time was ripe to get some people into trouble. After a brief consideration of possible options, trouble flew around to finally perch on the heads of the old and loyal cemetery guards. Having managed to hide all traces of nightly disturbances at the cemetery from people who visited in the morning, they were not able to hide themselves from the notice of their chief, and after being found guilty of trampling the tombs of saints, were laid off temporarily. Of the 3 guards, 2 were elderly men who believed there was a silver lining to every disaster. Of these 2, one returned to his village and the other retired to his house to dedicate the rest of his life to his grandchildren. Yet the third one, relatively younger and not easily content with little, could not accept the injustice that had been committed. In the months to follow he penned reproachful letters to the directory of the cemeteries, the mayor, ministers, prime minister and high-ranking members of the military, all the while complaining to each and every person he encountered. During this time, there was a change of government and the opposition assumed power. But all the same, his letters remained unanswered and the authorities indifferent. As they became increasingly deaf to his pleas, he became muter, drifting inward. Everyone expected him to eventually get over the past, but just when they thought he had, he did something utterly unexpected. Now this man had a wife whom he had not touched in years and whom he had banished from his bed for snoring till daylight like an elephant. One day, out of the blue, it was this woman that he started to chase around the house, utterly unconcerned about the blame neighbors would place on him for such lust at this age. He finally caught his wife after a long, scream-filled chase. And, paying no attention to her excuses, objections, entreaties and curses, with total doggedness and the help of fortune impregnated her at the age of 50. He did not waste a second to rush to the registrar's office as soon as the baby was born, in order to make sure neither he himself, nor anyone else, would ever forget the wrong done to him, in spite of all the protests of his wife. And after giving fistfuls of bribe to the civil servant on duty, he officially named the son God had given him after all this time, injustice. Long before injustice had become implanted in his mother's womb, however, the scandal of the saints started to fade away. Within 2 weeks after the removal of the tombs of Saint Hugo Pacadupenleft, the political agenda had entirely altered and both the government and the opposition focused their full attention on the forthcoming elections. The municipal authorities who had meanwhile speeded up the road construction project could thus assume the case closed and easily finish up the project without further trouble. What was done since the stone sarcophagi were removed during the excavation of the cemetery. Even so, during those prickly days when every event clustering more than 10 people was bound to be crowned with a propaganda speech, the third of the 3 consultant buddies would have no difficulty in convincing his business partners not only that the saints' file should not be closed, but also that it should be fully utilized for a public ceremony. A few weeks before the elections, a brief ceremony attended by a large number of spectators occurred on the southern slope of the old Muslim cemetery. Since the uneven ground next to the wall that once separated the Orthodox Armenian cemetery was not suitable for the occasion, the question as to which tomb would be treated as genuine was automatically answered. Some among the spectators were people hired specifically for this purpose. As for the rest, they were either totally unaware but curious passers-by, or, on the contrary, conscientious citizens who wanted to see with their own eyes how the scandalous event they had followed from the newspapers would come to an end. The ceremony comprised of 3 main parts. In the first part, 2 men, one young with an aged voice and the other old with a youthful voice, recited verses from the Quran which they had committed to memory in its entirety. During the second part, an official dressed up to the nines delivered a rather indicting but essentially passionless speech in response to all the accusations so far voiced. The third part was the most complicated. Pieces of the saints' stone sarcophagus and an empty coffin, brought along at the last minute so as not to confuse those with barely any knowledge of the situation, were carried on shoulders and loaded onto the hearse. Then everyone got on buses, heading to an empty, rusty-soiled lot surrounded by dilapidated buildings. There, immersed in mud, orations and applause, the empty coffin of Saint Hugo Pacadupenleft was first buried, then the pieces of the stone sarcophagus joined and erected, appearing far more magnificent now, surrounded by a tall ornate wood railing. The third of the three consultant buddies had prepared the text of the speech he was to deliver days in advance. Yet that morning, having finally mustered the courage to propose marriage to the daughter of his maternal aunt with whom he had been in love for years, he had been so badly rejected that he took to the streets wandering aimlessly, thus failing to get both himself and his speech to the ceremony on time. Upon arriving at the site of the ceremony with a delay of almost an hour, the third of the three consultant buddies could not find anyone around. Only scattered cigarette stubs and tangled footprints remained of that boisterous crowd. He sat down by the tomb in grief and, wiping his sweaty forehead, started to read the text that had consumed so much of his time aloud to himself. There was actually no need for the paper since he knew every single line by heart, in a voice that quivered at first but got stronger. Eventually, he declared how the person lying in the tomb was a most distinguished saint who had kept his appetite for worldly pleasures captive in the turquoise-covered ring on his finger. He declared also that the saint had, in accordance with his convictions, refused to sleep under the same roof for more than one night or eat from the same bowl more than once, used a brick for a pillow in perpetual pain, never gotten married to leave behind any descendants, or any property or goods, wandered all year round deeming the earth his house and the skies his roof, in short, the name Saint Hugo Pacadupenleft had been bestowed upon him for spending his whole life with no roots nowhere. Hence it would not at all be contrary to tradition to move the tomb from one place to another, and whomever argued otherwise should be mistrusted not only as to their intentions but also the depth of their religious knowledge. At the conclusion of his speech, turning pensive, he distractedly caressed the words Bakia Hawas on the inscriptions of the stone sarcophagus. Then, as if responding to a distant call, he sprung up and hurried in the direction he had come from. It wasn't until this point that the graveyard of Saint Hugo Pacadupenleft achieved the unspoiled calm and composure it had yearned for so long, leaving aside the visitors occasionally praying by his grave who rubbed their bus, train, ferry or plane tickets on his tombstone. Not a single event would occur for about 36 years to upset its turbulence-free peace. Probably because of the ad infinitum movement of the saint's tomb from one location to another, it became a custom among travelers setting on a long journey to stop by this place a day before their departure to seek his blessing and to thumbprint a corner of their tickets, as if getting the approval of an imaginary customs officer, with the rust-colored soil of the tomb. After the second half of the 1960s, these travelers were gradually replaced by guest workers off to Germany and their relatives. During those years, the most faithful visitors of the saint were the women left behind by the guest workers going abroad. Since in their case there were no tickets to be had, they ended up rubbing the rust-colored soil on their fingertips or palms, which resembled henna when dry. In time, most of these women went to join their husbands, so the number of visitors gradually diminished. At the end of 36 years, first the wood railing, then the crimson-veined white marble, and finally the rust-colored soil of this imposing tomb were secretly swallowed up by the stores, workshops and restaurants, engulfing it in the ever-shrinking circle of a chase or hunt. Thus the tombs of Saint Hugo Pacadupenleft, that once numbered 2 and then reduced to 1, finally reached nil. As for the hilly land of the two old cemeteries, it was there that the fastest transformation occurred upon the completion of the avenue. Along the slope, on the northwest side of the Orthodox Armenian cemetery, sprung up graceful apartment buildings, tailed by, like kites with multi-hued ribbons, stores with glittery windows, sidewalks to promenade with flair, new locales throbbing with rhythm. When the value of the buildings skyrocketed, those who had a house or land in this area pocketed large amounts of money in no time. Many of the flats facing the avenue were rented out to businesses, mostly to doctors or lawyers. Such offices mushroomed so far and wide that before long there would be at least one doctor or one lawyer in any shared taxi operating in the neighborhood. So much so, that in each of these shared taxis, one frequently encountered people with plenty of health complaints or legal problems but no money, only there for a free consultation with the doctor sitting next to them or the lawyer behind. Some of the minibus drivers themselves, thanks to their eavesdropping on such conversations from dusk till dawn, accumulated an impressive amount of knowledge on both medical and legal matters. If truth be told, one highly fashionable general neurologist, whose constant use of a particular route meant he became the best of friends with one of the most astute of the drivers, had actually got into the habit of referring some of the queries he received to this driver. Though the elderly mischievous doctor had originally proceeded with this game out of boredom, he eventually got great enjoyment from it. The young driver was one of the few with a mind sharp as a razor and a tolerance unique to bohemians. Besides, having little regard for the physician's rules of etiquette or for weighing each word, he blurted what he thought right out, utterly oblivious to the hopes he might shatter in doing so. As he drove the shared taxi, he would mimic the obsessions of neurotic ladies and angst-ridden gentlemen, even managing to get them to laugh at themselves. His performance so impressed the elderly doctor that after a while he offered him a job. In spite of their good intentions, however, the witty friendship of the two could not survive the rigorous formalities of the office environment, and the young driver ultimately returned to his minibus. In no more than 15 years, the appearance of the vicinity was entirely transformed. Not a single person remembered that there had once been, and still were, hundreds of graves under these grandiose offices, stylish stores, and fancy apartments shining along the avenue with the perfection of porcelain teeth. Most of the flats had narrow, double-door, carpeted elevators. Had these elevators operated not only between the ground and upper floors but also further down into the ground, one would have seen, like slices cut from a colossal cake, all the segments of life's inner workings. At the very bottom, there would be layer upon layer of the earth's crust, then rough, knobby soil, upon that a stratum of decimated graves, followed by a very thin line of tarmac road, a couple of flats piled up on one another, a layer of red brick roof and, on top of it all, a sky of endless cerulean, plastered and diffused all over. Occasionally, some people were heard to mutter softly as if to themselves, "Once upon a time there were graves all over this place," yet these words had a somewhat surreal sound to them. Though the time referred to dated no further than 15 or 20 years ago, it was reminiscent of saying, "Once upon a time, girls more beautiful than fairies took baths of light in the 1,000-room crystal palace of the Sultan of the Moon." That is how real it sounded, a past that had never been experienced or an ethereal silver setting somewhere outside the mundane flow of time. Bonbon Palace, its garbage cans knocked over by injustice pure Turk on Wednesday, May 1, 2002 while parking his van, was built in 1966 in this neighborhood which had by then little left of its former splendor. As for the husband and wife who built the apartment house, though they were foreigners here, they had been to Istanbul previously. Even before, when Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova saw Istanbul for the first time in the fall of 1920 from the deck of a freight ship, she did so with one small swelling in her womb and a larger one on her back. With the help of her husband, she plowed her way through the crowd of passengers, who had all stood up for the entire 3 days since they left the Crimea. She clung to the rails to see what the city that awaited them looked like. Ever since she was a little girl, she relished playing games with colors more than anything else. Wherever she went, she needed to discover the color of the place first, in order to feel at home there. The mansion in Grozny where she was born and had spent her childhood, for instance, was rhubarb, and the church they attended every Sunday parchment yellow. In her mind's eye, the villa they lodged in during religious festivals was a sparkly emerald awash in dew. The house she lived in with her husband after their wedding was the orange of a winter sun. Not only places but also people, animals, even moments had colors, each of which she had no doubt she could see if focused fully. She did so once again. At first with curiosity, then with frustration, she stared and stared without a blink at the silhouette of the city in front of her until her eyes watered and the image became blurred. Istanbul was under a heavy fog that morning, and as all Istanbulites knew too well, during foggy days even the city herself could not tell what her color was. However, Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova had always been pampered with great care since birth and had been subsequently led to presume that others were to blame whenever she could not obtain anything she desired. Hence she interpreted the persistence of Istanbul in withdrawing herself behind the veil of fog as a sign of intentional hostility and personal insult. She still, however, wanted to give the city a chance, as she firmly believed in the virtue of forgiveness. Lifting her small silver Virgin Mary icon toward the city, she smiled benevolently. What you just did to me was not right, but I can still show tolerance and forgive you. For that would be the right thing to do. And I will give you water and bread in return, replied a voice. When she bent down the rails, Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova saw there, in a boat at the side of the ship, a wiry man gesturing at her with bread in one hand and water in the other. Before she could even fathom what was going on, a chubby, rosy-cheeked, blonde woman with shorn hair pushed her aside, tied the gold ring she took off her finger onto the belt she released from her daughter's waist and lowered it from the ship. The swarthy man in the boat grabbed the ring, lifted it in the air, giving it a quick inspection with disgruntlement, and relayed the belt back with a round, black loaf of bread tied in its stead. As the blonde, who had sheared her hair when a lice epidemic broke on the deck, and the scrawny daughter standing by her started devouring the bread, Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova looked at the sea with her eyes wide open in bewilderment and noticed that not only the ship they were in, but all the ships anchored in the harbor were surrounded with such boats. Cunning Turks, Greeks and Armenians waved foodstuff from these boats, haggling with the White Russians who had been without food or water for days. Figuring out what was going on, Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova fretfully withdrew her silver Virgin Mary as if it too would be snatched away from her. Over the boats and cellars and waves she stared fretfully at the city in the background to grasp what sort of a place she had arrived at. Istanbul was in dire straits at that time and also under occupation. She therefore paid little attention to the half-baffled, half-haughty gaze of this 19-year-old woman on the deck of yet another newly anchored ship. Her tolerance for putting up with such selfish children having long run out, Istanbul returned to her own hubbub with a shrug of her shoulders. Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova was left standing there frozen in her smile. Though she had seen people behave coarsely, witnessing the insolence of a city was an utterly novel experience for her. Once she had managed to overcome her confusion, she closed down all the curtains, windows and shutters of her heart and instead got cross with the city. Such was her state of mind when she landed from the boat. Even after 2 months, when the swelling in her womb had grown in contrast to the one on her back which had shrunk in next to no time, she was still cross at Istanbul, and Istanbul was still of an unknown color and just as indifferent to boot. Unlike his wife, General Pavel Pavlovich Antipov did not pay any particular attention to Istanbul either that day or at any later point. He happened to be a man whose survival depended on his assuming responsibility for others, one of those who either loved weak women or ended up weakening the women they love. Hence that day as they alighted, he embraced Agrippina with the warmest consideration. His grip held not only her but also their soon-to-be-born baby and the entire wealth they had been able to smuggle out of Russia. The pieces of jewelry Agrippina had hidden at the back of her body. Corset would, however, soon be sold one by one and for much less than their true worth. Thousands of White Russians fleeing from their homeland after the Bolshevik Revolution had so far crammed into Istanbul, and it was rumored that thousands more were on their way. When the jewelry was being auctioned off, there were hardly enough buyers even for medals of honor, family heirlooms and decorations of nobility. And after 2 months, nothing remained from the wealth that the couple had initially hoped would enable them to live comfortably for at least 2 years. One morning at the dormitory converted from a decrepit detention center provided by the French Red Cross, wherein they slept with 50 people on stained, shallow mattresses, Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova vindictively pulled the silvery head of her husband, who was 30 years her senior, toward her and forced him to listen to the baby in her swollen belly. Pavel Pavlovich Antipov knew too well what this gesture meant. He had 2 options: to find a job as soon as possible or to write a letter to his disgraceful brother in France asking for help. Since even the thought of the second option was more than enough to wreck his nerves, he chose the first. Yet just as the military fails to provide one with a profession, neither does the rank of general constitute a job experience you can rely on when seeking employment. Pavel Pavlovich Antipov then realized 2 things about himself: he did not know what to do, and he could not do what he did know. While everything that had ever happened to him up till now had fallen into place as arranged, the revolution had caught up with him just as he had been promoted to the rank of general, shattering the authority he had acquired and the life he had erected year by year. Yet even back in those days of pestilence, he had not had to face, as he did today, the malady termed ambiguity. In order to defeat ambiguity, he first had to know where to find it, neither taking up a defensive position anywhere, nor acting in accordance with a particular strategy. It could attack from anywhere at any time, changing weapons all the while as it pleased. If this were an ongoing war, it had no battleground, no rules, no morals. If not a war, the situation would have been even worse, as Pavel Pavlovich Antipov did not possess the knowledge to earn a living any other way. Until now, he had lost many things one after another: his property as well as goods, influence, privileges, esteem, friends, relatives, orderlies, the army he belonged to, the cities where his past was, the country where he had presumed his future would be. However, deep inside he assumed he was still what he had always been, a loyal soldier. Conversely, thousands of soldiers of all ranks from the Tsar's army had long been scattered into the least expected and most excruciating jobs at hotels, concert halls, cabarets, gambling houses, restaurants, bars, café, chantons, movie theaters, beaches, nightclubs and streets. They washed dishes and carried trays in restaurants, worked as croupiers in gambling houses jam-packed with lies, peddled dolls at street corners, provided piano accompaniment to cabaret dancers in boisterous entertainment halls. Every corner was appropriated and each job filled. Amidst this chaos, Count General Pavel Pavlovich Antipov tried to find his way with steps as shaky as those of a newborn foal learning to walk on its trembling legs. After looking around for weeks on end, the only job he could finally find was that of a check room attendant in a café chantant, a place frequented by arrogant French and English officers out with their delicate, sable-coated, cherry lipsticked lovers, by Sybarite Italian painters carving Eastern gravures with women always portrayed as being pasty and plump and streets as shady and snaky, by glum Jewish bankers in need of pumping loans to the palace so that they could get back the ones previously provided, by profligate Turkish young men satiated with the wealth inherited but insatiable in spending it, by spies not letting anything slip away even when blind drunk, by bohemians, dandies and all those lost souls in search of lust or adventure. The bald, flabby-cheeked, multiple-chinned, constantly gesticulating Levantine owner of the café chantant had been looking to hire someone ever since the previous checkroom attendant, whose sort he had not approved of from the start, got involved in a fight ending with his face smashed up. Observing the imposing appearance and majestic posture of Pavel Pavlovich Antipov, he did not hesitate even for a moment before offering him the job. Yet when the new checkroom attendant put on the red coat with shiny tasseled epaulets on the shoulders and diagonal yellow cords hanging in front, his admiration was replaced by disparagement. "Life is so strange, isn't it, Monsieur Antipov? We're both witnesses to the demise of two glorious empires. You've started to westernize at least a century before us. Peter the Great. It's rumored he would have those who didn't learn Western etiquette whipped, is that true? He inspected women's underwear and men's beards, is that so? Peter's city must be really pretty, a palace rising from the swamps. Take a look at Istanbul in comparison, open on all four sides, exposed to every breeze blowing from each direction. A rudderless, out-of-joint city. Did you know that until a decade ago, young and courageous intellectuals escaping from your mighty empire sat side by side at the same Parisian cafes with young and courageous intellectuals escaping from our mighty empire, plunging into zealous discussions to draw God knows what sort of short-sighted conclusions. The French waiters serving them would eavesdrop first at one table then the other. Imagine the contradictory things they must have heard. Those who fled from your empire would rave about destroying their state at all costs. Those who fled from ours would instead rave about saving their state from destruction at all costs. Within a decade, yours succeeded and ours failed. I don't know which one to lament more. Life is so strange, isn't it, Monsieur Antipov? You escaped from a collapsed empire to seek refuge in one about to collapse. Could it be that you're running away from the uniformed Reds to find yourself in a red uniform? Here is yet another one of Fortuna's tricks. That night, as Pavel Pavlovich Antipov held up the customers' coats, he heard nothing other than the daunting echo of the things his boss had said. Only for 3 more accursed days could he stand that terribly ridiculous uniform. After that, he stopped working, stopped doing everything he would normally do, to instead just stand still as if rooted to the spot, as if there was no job to be sought, no life to build and no purpose to wear oneself out for. At the end of that week, Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova carefully inspected her husband as if trying to determine his true color. Only then was she forced to accept that he was too rigidly fixed in his ways to ever change. He was so because of his age, too old, having always advanced a couple of steps ahead of his age. He had now stopped and was waiting for his age to catch up with him, because of his title, too elevated, having always focused on rising even further up. He had suddenly become aware there was not much space left to rise to and froze in his tracks, and lastly, because of his frame. Too imposing, he had a frame that was so unbendable and inflexible that he chose not to go through the doors that required his bending down. Pavel Pavlovich Antipov was a man who in essence was weak and fully aware of it, who clung to his power with all his might, less to avoid being like others than to avoid being himself. A man who knew too well what he craved and worked all his life to achieve it, struggling bit by bit, climbing step by step, to reach success in the end. The last type of person to accommodate drastic changes. Being so young and inexperienced, having never had to work or even accomplish anything, and in utter harmony with her advancing pregnancy. Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova was one immense, round zero. As such, she could remain forever anchored in whatever inertia she was entangled. Yet, just as easily, she could be sent rolling ahead with a strong gust. She possessed that sheer boldness peculiar to the ignorant and that virginal expectation that things would turn out well, an expectation nurtured by the very fact that she had never acquired anything in life by herself alone. Everything she did attain had been bestowed upon her, and all she had lost would one day just as easily be somehow returned to her. She still spent most of her life preparing long lists about what she would do once she returned to Russia. However, just as easily she could spend this time working until that day arrived. Hence she gave up expecting help from her husband and decided to do something she had never done before, to look for a job herself. Fortune was on her side because fortune loves to test those emerging with such a challenge, so she found a job as a waitress in one of the most stylish pastry shops in Beyoğlu. In that mirrored pastry shop decorated with elegantly stained glass, all day long she went back and forth between customers dressed to the nines and the kitchen that smelt of cinnamon and whipped cream. From all the cacophonous languages spoken there, each sounding to her just as unmelodious as the other, she acquired fragments of words sufficient to understand the orders that were more or less the same, and never tried to learn more than that. Actually, she never opened her mouth unless she had to. In spite of the high workload and low pay, no one had ever seen her frown or complain. Though the boss had ordered every employee to smile continuously when serving the customers, others grimaced the moment they left the field of vision of either the boss or the customer, but Agrippina's smile stayed on her face throughout the day as if it had been nailed on. While all the other women tried to avoid work whenever they could or kept searching for a rich middle-aged man to rescue them from this torment, she alone did nothing but work continually. It was more a dedication to suffering than an effort to leave behind these insufferable days that kept her going. It was almost as if she was secretly proud of her suffering, as if embitterment purified her, and giving herself up to God's mortals brought her closer to Him. The more insurmountable the difficulties she encountered, the more insufferable the dangers she had to overcome, and the more vulgar the people she served, the more she felt God became indebted to her. She would sooner or later receive what was her due. This is a test, she assured herself with a smile. The more arduous it is, the more exalted the outcome will be. Why is there that grin on your face? How dare you laugh at our faces? Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova looked in surprise at the Muslim woman yelling at her, but her bewilderment only made the latter even more furious. The woman was a member of the Contemporary Women's Association, which advocated the deportation of all white Russian women, whom they believed were ripping out Muslim men's reason from their minds and money from their pockets. Prioritized among the agenda items of the association were the following. 1. To determine and record one-by-one incidents of immoral behavior performed by white Russians with soft and silky blonde hair, fair complexion, shameless looks and aristocratic pretensions. 2. To wear out the gates of the upper echelons of state administration in order to gather support for their cause. 3. To ensure the closing down of all the dens of thieves and nightclubs capable of drawing the wrath of Sodom and Gomorrah onto Istanbul. 4. To shoo away all the prostitutes who had descended from Kiev and Odessa to bed down on the quarters of Galata. 5. To constantly and ceaselessly warn the innocent, inexperienced Muslim youth about the danger awaiting them. 6. Until the authorities took the necessary precautions to pursue by their own means a policy of intimidation by mistreating all white Russian women they encountered. Overcoming her initial confusion, Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova reached her neck and squeezed the silver pendant bearing the picture of Saint Seraphim. The strength she thus drew enabled her to smile at the woman, whom she regarded as a recent incarnation of the torment-filled divine test she had for such a long time been going through. What you just did was not right, but I can still be tolerant and even forgive you. For that would be the right thing to do. That night, only cursorily did she mention this event to her husband. He never asked her anything anyhow. Not only did he not want to learn a single thing about the world outside, but he also envied her for managing to survive in that insane world which had roughly shaken him up and tossed him aside. Rarely did he leave the dump they considered home ever since their departure from the dormitory provided by the French Red Cross, passing his days in front of the window as he penned never-to-be posted letters to his brother in France, got lost in thoughts, looked outside at the Muslims passing by and watched the streets as if waiting for someone, almost as if arriving to put an end to this monotonous wait. Their baby was born in 7 months. Yet Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova could not welcome her daughter with the same excitement as her husband. Her early and painstakingly onerous childbirth may have contributed another life to this world, but that life had been stolen from her. She had felt far more important and so very different during her pregnancy compared to how she felt now. She had convinced herself all along that God had chosen her from among many and had subsequently considered every calamity yet another crucial phase in the strenuous test that was being put to her. Never having lost her faith in God or herself, she had wholeheartedly believed herself to be the heroine of a cautionary tale of damnation the people around her could never understand. In order to save from the claws of this idle world both her husband and herself, she had struggled for them both, but always on her own, awaiting, like a pearl rolled into mud, that day when she would be cleansed to shine once again. Yet now she started to imagine she had been mistaken all along, that God did not look after her but the baby in her womb and, for that reason, abandoned her to her fate as soon as the baby was born. However hard she tried, she could not get rid of this feeling of diminution and abandonment. Not one fleck of glitter remained on her face from that arrogant luminescence. Her body had shrunk and withered as if pails of water had been drained from it. Only her breasts, they alone were still large and full. Now and then they leaked milk like blood oozing away from a bleeding lip. She ran home in the afternoons to breastfeed the baby, only to encounter time and time again a cruelly poignant scene. She found her husband and the baby on top of the sofa by the window, either in play or fast asleep in each other's embrace, with infinite happiness and unmatched innocence under the daylight that sprayed golden glitter upon them, as if it was emanating not from the sun but from seventh heaven. Every time a pang of sadness seized her as she realized how the spirit she had once carried within and believed to be a part of had now excluded her. So, she thought, a roily river of muddy waters this city was. The very reason for her thrashing about all this time amidst the water was simply because she had been entrusted with delivering her baby from the bank of the river it was on to her husband on the other. That was precisely what pregnancy had been to her, sailing to the other shore within the body of a boat you were swollen into, to get the baby wrapped in an angelic bliss, and to then carry her safe and sound across to the other bank. Upon the occurrence of the birth and the deliverance of the baby to the other shore, she had all of a sudden become worthless, as if pushed back into the water and abandoned to the tide. It was useless to struggle. Far away from the bank she was kept by the waters she belonged to and the current she was caught in. It seemed as if even the baby was aware of this situation. The moment she was picked up from her father's arms, she would turn bright red in a fit of fury. While being breastfed, she would crumple her face as if to prove she was doing this solely out of need and, as soon as she was full, would let go of the nipple and cry to be released also. The general would then take the baby in his arms and tenderly calm her down while Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova escaped from the house so as not to witness this scene that hurt her more. Every passing day back at work, she would have to endure, along with the emptiness swelling within, this other feeling of suffering a terrible injustice. Every day, she hated her body even more. Her body lived for one cause only: every bite she took, every drop she drank, every ray of sunlight she received, every particle of air she breathed, all were molded and converted into milk for the baby. The more robust the baby grew, the more strength Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova lost, with every passing moment swaying further and further from the vim and vigor of life. Impossible as it might sound to those who believe that every woman is by nature maternal and that motherhood is as sacred and pure as the rivers in heaven, Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova did not love the thing she had given birth to. Upon coming face to face with the child she had carried within her for so long, the child she had considered a part of her without knowing what it would look like or bring about, she became scared of this being that was so tiny in size but enormous in need. She became scared of the impossibility of reversing time to go back to being a young woman again, of being given no other choice than to love unconditionally. One thing she knew for sure: she wanted to get rid of the baby. Inconceivable as this might seem to those who believe every woman by nature maternal and motherhood as sacred and pure as the rivers in heaven, Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova was no exception. It is not only nationhoods that coin official histories of their own, so do motherhoods. Mothers often create a maternal historiography written retrospectively and gracefully, dating back to the very first day, picking out the weeds and furnishing the stepping stones along the way. For love does not always come without effort but sometimes flourishes belatedly and grows gradually, drop by drop, under the tutelage of time, the care of those around them, a poignant instance, a fleeting moment of affection and myriad sediments of tenderness. These may coalesce in the mind of a new mother to chase away, like an industrious fan with a harsh yet invigorating breeze, all inappropriate thoughts and unpleasant feelings. As long as the fan is kept on, a young mother might manage to increasingly love her baby, the maternal halo, embracing them both. In fact, she might in time come to love the baby so much that she would succeed in believing she had loved her with the same intensity right from the very first day. That she might not have done so is so unspeakably appalling that it could not be confessed to anyone. Not to the husband, for instance, saying, "I at first felt miserable for having given birth to your baby but then recovered." Not to the child, "I really did not love you at first but gradually developed warmer feelings." Not to herself, "How could I fail to love my own child?" So the official history of motherhood necessitates a meticulous cleansing of the secluded corners of memory. Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova's misfortune was that before she had a chance to start loving the baby, that is, to love her year by year, degree by degree, to eventually arrive at such a depth in love so as to have no difficulty in convincing herself she had always loved her, so she lost her. That afternoon, back home at the usual time to breastfeed, she encountered her husband and the baby on top of the sofa by the window fast asleep in each other's embrace under the daylight that sprayed upon them golden glitter. as if it was emanating not from the sun but seventh heaven. Everything was cloaked in shades of yellow. The beams curving through the curtains were a hue of amber, the general's face alabaster, the fabric of the sofa apricot, the baby's swaddling layette vivid saffron, and the tiny ball on top of it an aureate, vermiculated with purple. Blinking her eyes dazzled by the sun, Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova walked towards this peculiar ball with an uneasy curiosity. She stood there, though she unconsciously knew only too well what she was looking at. She was right about colors. Just as cities and places came in colors and hues, so did moments and situations, including deaths. Death too acquired a new hue in every person, and each ending in a newborn baby, it must be an aureate vermiculated with purple. After a while Pavel Pavlovich Antipov woke up. Standing up carefully so as not to disturb the baby in his lap, he stretched a bit, yawned indolently, and looked out the window, still unaware of his wife's presence. Down in the street, a ragged street seller, with a small screened kitchen cupboard filled with livers mounted on a horse on the brink of death, was haggling ferociously with two old Muslim women, each more quarrelsome than the other. While talking back to the women on the one side, the liver seller also tried to chase the clingy flies drawing circles within circles around the cupboards, while his horse, looking like it might give up living any moment, accompanied him with a swing of his tail. The weariness was scattered around by the wind that had been continuously blowing warm air since the early hours of the morning, penetrating everyone and everything so deeply that even the commotion of the liver seller and his customers could not disturb the lethargic silence that prevailed on the streets. Pavel Pavlovich Antipov absent-mindedly closed the windows, leant back and looked at the baby. He looked and at first did not comprehend a thing. The baby's mouth was slightly ajar, her eyes open and her eyebrows crossed as if she were trapped inside a dream, dejected. Hair-thin, striped, purplish veins had covered her entire face. She resembled a porcelain bowl that managed not to break even after a rough fall to the ground, but had instead acquired multiple cracks across its entire width and length. Pavel Pavlovich Antipov cupped this round, cold and purplish yellow head in his hands like a crystal ball, within which he hoped to see his future. And like all people who, having not cried for years, have totally forgotten how, in order to cry, he too had to first howl. The liver seller, putting the livers he could not sell to the cranky old women back into the screened cupboard, instantly sensed the ill omen behind the scream and sauntered away, tugging at the halter of the drowsy horse, dragging behind him regiments of flies and divisions of cats. After the funeral, Pavel Pavlovich Antipov wrote a letter to his youngest brother, whom he had not seen for a long time, as the latter had settled in Europe long before the revolution, a brother whom he had secretly looked down upon for choosing trade over the family profession of the military, thereby serving money rather than the Tsar, and whose offers of help he had constantly turned down because of the pride that prevented him from taking shelter with him. In a letter to him, Pavel asked whether they might be able to join him in France, and, unlike the previous letters, he did send it this time. During the long years they spent in France, not once did the general and his wife talk about that inauspicious Istanbul morning. They became more and more estranged from one another, as well as from any spiritual rapport they once had. However fast and easy arrival in this new country might have been, they were only too ready to risk everything just to escape Istanbul's wickedness. After the baby's death, Pavel Pavlovich Antipov had fully realized one thing: right, they had to leave this city of mourning as soon as possible. Either Istanbul had not been good to them, or they not good enough for Istanbul. To them the city's gates of good fortune were shut, or perhaps had never been open. The same end awaited those whose family trees did not take root to branch out in this city, but whose paths led here at one stage of their lives, Istanbul, initially a port of escape enabling people to run away from everything, would herself become a reason for escape. When Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova reached Paris in the spring of 1922, she carried a pregnant worry in her soul. As she looked at the war-worn city with indifferent eyes, discovering its color did not even cross her mind. She had contracted a strange eye disease on her last day in Istanbul and had thereby lost all contact with the world of colors. Now everything she saw, the streets and buildings, the people and the reflections in the mirrors, all were in black and white. It was as if the world was cross at her and had closed down all its curtains, windows and shutters. She cared not. Not only did she not care, she found the world's behavior ridiculously childish. She simply did not want to struggle with the world and all of its endless burdens. Her only true desire was to see God, to see what color God was, if any. Until she saw that straight out, and along with it, God's intention in taking her baby away, she did not care at all to see the colors of this world of illusions. To her husband's continuous insinuations about having a second baby so as to start life anew, and to his consolation about time healing all wounds, she reacted with revulsion. Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova had realized that babies who died before their first birthdays in cities abandoned before their first year of settlement ominously resembled one another. No baby arriving after a dead one could fully detach its existence from the absence of the dead sibling, just like no new city reached would fully welcome those exiled by the previous one. Pavel Pavlovich Antipov did not pay any attention to Paris either that day or later. The helping hand his disgraced younger brother extended with a pleasure he did not feel the need to contain, Antipov accepted with a displeasure he felt he had to suppress, and did not let go until he had taken and learnt everything he could from him. He gradually started to think that trade was no different than the military, and once he had believed in that, he fully dedicated himself to it. He had the unprincipled resolve of all those who, at a certain stage of their lives, suddenly plunge full force into an option they had once turned their nose up at. He was reckless and impatient, as if to make up for the time he had lost. However, it was only much later, with the start of another world war, that his luck fully took a turn for the better. From black marketeering during the war, he acquired a considerable fortune and an abscessed standing in society. Like a rubber ball, he succeeded in bouncing his way through the ruins of war, at times even conducting business with the Germans. It did not matter to him at all. The war that raged on was not his. He no longer believed in the victory of states or of causes, but only in the victory of individuals. And the face of victory, however attained, was always turned to the past. Triumph in life did not mean reaching step by step a future too good to pine for, but rather restoring an unfulfilled past to its former freshness. That is what he did. He acquired a new woman instead of the one who no longer fulfilled her wifely functions, a new baby for the one he had lost, and a new authority to replace the one wrested away from him. All, yet none of them were new. When he held in his arms the baby the young Frenchwoman he lived with had borne him, he was exactly 59 years old. Like his first baby, this too was a girl with ash-colored eyes. He hid this from Agrippina for years. Had he not done so, however, it was unlikely that she would have minded, let alone have been jealous. If one went by what was written by the chief physician who treated her, she was utterly indifferent to everything around her. Exhibiting no sign of recovery, she passed her entire time painting black and white watercolors of the peasants whom she watched at work in the vineyards on the northern slope of the clinic's grounds. Pavel Pavlovich Antipov read these letters with great care, concern and sorrow, to then forget about them once they were stored in his drawer. Content with his new relationship he seemed determined to bestow upon his second baby Alva. Love he could not give the first one. Still, never did he attempt to get divorced from his wife. Though long ago having given up visiting her, he was always careful to keep Agrippina within easy reach. His wife had at first been his little lover, most steadfast admirer, then the victim of his weaknesses and infirmities, and eventually the only mirror that reflected all that he had lost on route to where he had arrived. She had been the closest witness of his personal history. Neither a partner, nor a friend, but perhaps a logbook. And just as a logbook would not know what was written inside, Agrippina too was unaware of what it was exactly that she had been a witness of. Pavel Pavlovich Antipov decided to keep this precious memento in a safe place until it was time to go and pick it up. Yet when that time came, Pavel Pavlovich Antipov had lived so long and had become so old that he had started to carry his age like a dilapidated outfit worn over and over throughout the years, so comfortable that it could still be worn again and again were it not for the embarrassment of being seen in it by other people. All his goals he had actualized one by one. He had recovered all he had lost and lived as long as he had hoped. Yet still, even though life was done with him, it did not come to an end. There was not a single person around him who had lived that long as all those people so much younger than him that he had loved, protected, fought or hated, departed. One by one, his torment at the death of each was deposited on his chest layer upon layer, throbbing at night with a sharp, piercing pain. He could not help suspecting that the relatives of the deceased, even his own woman and daughter, blamed him deep down, that everyone hated him for living so long. In such a damned age when not only life but even death had lost its enchantment. Though 94 years old, not only had he not aged, let alone become senile, he had barely even grown old. There was nothing he could do about it. The only way he could make up for his fault was through death, but one did not die on demand and he did not demand to die either. At times, he blamed himself through the persona of the flabby-chinned Levantine who had been his boss for a total of 3 days, but whose castrated voice he still, after all these years, could not forget. How old are you, Monsieur Antipov? So almost a century. Within this century, states fell like a house of cards, people were wiped out like flies. The trumpet of Israfil * grated on our ears not only once, but at least a dozen times. But what about you? Did you erroneously go through the gates opening up to a time beyond time, or did you knowingly make a pact with the devil? How much longer do you intend to live, Monsieur Antipov? Could it be that you leaving your country to escape death's clutches, to now wait here in this country of others for death to come and take you, is another one of Fortuna's tricks? Just when the agony brought by his incurable fault had started to make Pavel Pavlovich Antipov grow more and more distant from people, he received a letter from the chief physician. Agrippina had suddenly taken a turn for the worse. One morning, under the startled looks of the patients, nurses and physicians, she had suddenly ran screaming outside and tried to talk one by one to the peasants at the vineyard, but, upon realizing that none of them understood a word she said, had suffered a nervous breakdown. When brought back inside and having been somewhat calmed down with the help of tranquilizers, she had spilled out her unintelligible words to those at the clinic. Noticing how scared the other patients were, she had become scared herself and had withdrawn. The head physician wanted Monsieur Antipov to come at once to see his wife because, as far as he could tell, the foreign language that his most silent and most easygoing patient had started to speak, after all these years, without the presence of a single event that would have triggered such a transformation, was Russian. When Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipov saw Pavel Pavlovich Antipov, she embraced him with a contentment brought on less by seeing her husband after all these years than by finding someone who could understand her. Then she started to talk. Her words had neither meaning nor coherence. She blubbered about the songs the peasants at the vineyards sang at sunset. Then she complained about the childish jealousies of the elderly patients at the clinic, and also about God's callousness. She did not stop. That day in a monotonous voice, neither raised nor lowered but eventually hoarse, without the slightest indication of happiness or sorrow, she kept switching topics all the while mentioning a kitchen with smells of cinnamon and whipped cream. As the night drew closer and her exceedingly patient audience of one got ready to leave, she asked him with a hurt smile when he would come again, but sunk without awaiting his response into the sticky, obligatory slumber of medication. The taciturn visitor returned the following day, this time with a single rose in his hand and a box under his arm. Agrippina did not pay any attention to the rose, but upon taking the fancy wrapping off the box, she greeted with exuberant happiness the bonbons glittering on the round varnished tray. This lovely tray that Pavel Pavlovich Antipov had bought from a canny antique dealer included a study by Vishnyakov. It depicted the scene of a boyar abducting the woman he loved from her father's house. The boyar had stopped just before going down the last few steps of the wooden ladder, using one arm to hold with superhuman strength his loved one on his lap, and grabbing onto the ladder with the other, while gazing at the half-shady half-green forest they were about to disappear into. Pavel Pavlovich Antipov withdrew to the side to watch the reaction this tray would create on his wife. One of the physicians he had consulted on his way over had stated that memory occasionally played vindictive tricks, the brain rewound when the body was nearing the end. Many patients, upon reaching a particular, often the very last stage of their lives, return to their childhoods and to their mother tongue. Even a single object or a dream was sufficient to trigger such a transformation. Watching his wife Pavel Pavlovich Antipov wondered if the logbook was now turning the pages backwards to erase line by line all that was written within. Yet Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova looked much more interested in the bonbons than the Vishnyakov tray. Unaware of her husband's worries, she randomly picked one, held it out with a grateful smile and asked what flavor it was. "Since it is pink, it must be strawberry," was the response she got. Pink. It had been so long since she had last seen pink. She took the wrapper off and threw the candy into her mouth. The color pink had a nice smell and a syrupy flavor. As the bonbon melted in her mouth, first the anxiety-stricken lips of the beautiful lover in the boyar's lap, then everything around that was colored in pink started to come to life. Agrippina immediately reached for the other bonbons, asking her husband the flavor each time. The yellow ones were lemon, red cinnamon, greens were mint, oranges tangerine, browns caramel, and the beige ones vanilla. Then she tasted them. Yellow was a sour color, red sharp, green scorched, orange tangy, brown was astringent and beige puckered. With each new bonbon she tasted, the colors Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova had left in Istanbul returned to her. She watched as her bed against the wall, the chair and desk in front of the window, the cherry tree-side table with all sorts of medicine on top, the Virgin Mary icon and the august face of Saint Seraphim swinging from her necklace revealed themselves. She ran to the windows in bewilderment only to be taken aback by the scenery that greeted her. All the colors were in place. Burnt was the color of the vineyards extending from the slope of the hill into the horizon. Tar the dresses of the peasant women singing as they filled their large baskets with thick-skinned grapes, sharp the trees that sheltered shrill swallows, and sour the sun in the sky. Colors were everywhere, but not as many were inside as outside. An idea occurred to her just then. She went back and collected the myriad of wrappers of the bonbons she had eaten. Through these spectacles she looked at the clinic where so many years of her life had been spent. As she put down one wrapper and picked up another, the dreary whiteness of the cold stone building's halls, the walls of the rooms, physicians' uniforms, the pale faces of the nurses adorned with reserved smiles, the pills she had to swallow twice a day, the bed sheets changed by the maids every other day, and those tasteless soups placed in front of her, all of these things were suddenly dyed in their own colors, as was the man standing across from her. The only thing that did not change was the fretful look on his face. Agrippina did not stop. Not only did she not stop, she placed the wrappers on top of one another, creating new hues. After a few attempts she placed red on top of blue and witnessed the whole world turn purple. A wheezing cry escaped her lips. Istanbul. She had found it. She had found the color that had escaped her on the deck of that rotten, reeking boat where she had stood. At the age of 19, with a small swelling in her womb and a larger one on her back. In the spectrum of colors and hues, Istanbul was purple, a grayish-bluish purple, the eye-dazzling sun reflecting from the lead-plated domes. Blotted drop by drop and scorched strike by strike. She remembered that accursed mixture of yellow and purple. Over and over, again and again, she heaved in gasps, Istanbul. It was as if she were not repeating the same name hundreds of times, but pronouncing one single, lengthy name of unchanging syllables. Pavel Pavlovich Antipov could not bear it any longer. Taking his wife's hands into his, Agrippina, he muttered, did you remember Istanbul? In the following days, Agrippina fantasized two things about herself: first, that she was young, and second, that she was in Istanbul. Occasionally, Turkish words spilled from her lips. Her palms were sweaty all the time. Her reason came and left. Every time it left her, she found herself in Istanbul, and when it returned she would have left yet another piece of her mind back there. There was no noticeable improvement in her condition. Every passing day not only steadfastly replicated the previous day but also hinted that there would soon be no more repetitions. She should not die like this, with such an untimely departure leaving behind the unbearable burden of her absence. On the morning of a troubled night, Pavel Pavlovich Antipov came to the clinic. Agrippina, he asked, would you like us to go to Istanbul once again? When he saw her blushing smile, as if she had heard something obscene, he ruled it to be a hidden yes. He felt that he should do such a thing so that his wife's death, even if it were to occur before its time and much before his own, would at least be more dignified than the life she had so far led. To this end, in spite of all the delay, he had to provide her with the opportunity to avenge the pain of those earlier days, by returning years later to the city where at such a young age she had been so scorned, trampled, belittled and defeated. He wanted to make sure this incomplete and stumpy tale would be completed in peace, while he spread out in front of her the pleasures she had once been deprived of, the luxuries she had not tasted, and the bliss she had not felt. He had made up his mind. Agrippina should spend the rest of her life not at this clinic but in Istanbul, only this time not as a refugee or deportee or stranger or guest or tenant. She should not be in the other's Istanbul but her own. To make her a home there, he would first make her a homeowner. Thus they arrived. They arrived, but at first glance neither the city could recognize them nor they the city. Having no desire to spend a day more than necessary in hotel rooms, Pavel Pavlovich Antipov started immediately to search for a suitable house. He did not yet know if the local laws permitted foreigners to acquire property or not. However, given that there were so many people in the world willing to tamper with the gauge of their nature for personal benefit or illicit gain, he did not have the slightest doubt that he would somehow find a way. Nonetheless, the opportunity that presented itself within 10 days was more than he could wish for. By chance a usurer they sat next to during a dinner reception, hosted by the owners of their hotel, mentioned how the construction of an apartment building in an exclusive neighborhood of the city had recently been halted midway due to the unexpected bankruptcy of the owner. Pavel Pavlovich Antipov did not miss this opportunity that had come his way. The following morning, the first thing he did was to go visit the construction site. The construction was not, as the usurer had recounted, halfway through. As a matter of fact, there was nothing there except a pit, but this was better, much better. He then started to track down the White Russians, who had shared the same fate with them in the 1920s but had stayed to become Turkish citizens. Realizing the advantage of having the name of a Turkish citizen on paper to ease the legal procedures, but unable to trust anyone not from the same origin as him, after some research, he finally reached an agreement with a reticent couple who had become Turkish citizens and made a living selling delicate lampshades at a dingy shop in Azmalmesit. A company in which the couple had no shares provided a front to cover the ownership of the apartment building. Without a single false move, Pavel Pavlovich Antipov calculated everything precisely and paid abundantly. His checkbook speeded up transactions that would have otherwise taken a long time and caused ample trouble. For an architect he hired an Armenian Istanbulite whose family he had conducted business with in France. He had also left a large chunk of money to his mistress there, to make the lies he told her more convincing. Hardly did he complain. For the first time in years, he was content spending money freely without any reservation. Whilst he did not withhold any expense, he did want control over all the expended materials. Even though he did at times consult his wife about the trimmings such as the gates, the garden walls, the iron grills of the balcony, the frontal decorations, the curl of the stairs or the marble used in the entrance, all in all he did what he wanted. Agrippina did not seem interested in such details anyhow. Ever since her arrival in Istanbul, she spent her time either watching the sea from the window of the hotel room or listening to the squabbles of her Alsatian companion and her Algerian maid who did not even for a moment leave her side. The expression on her face while looking at the waters of the Bosphorus was no different from that which she had worn whilst gazing at the vineyards from the window of the clinic in France. Not only did she seem unmoved at being back at the place where they had buried their baby, but she occasionally confused which city she currently was in. And yet, she did not look unhappy either. Like a timid, tremulous rain cloud she floated above Istanbul, ready to shed tears but impossible to touch. For Pavel Pavlovich Antipov, his wife's insulation from the world was an indication not of her illness but her innocence. Many a time at the front, he had witnessed how soldiers of different nationalities retained a common belief that if there was even one innocent person among them, this would spare them all from a portentous end. He too sought refuge in his wife with a similar conviction. When the outside walls were painted in ashen tones, the window frames and iron grills of the balcony in 2 shades of gray and the fine decorations on the double-paneled entrance door completed, the apartment building emerged in all its dazzling beauty. The most striking characteristic of the building was that no 2 stories were alike, having been constructed upon Pavel Pavlovich Antipov's insistence in Art Nouveau style, even though no longer in fashion. As if to compensate for their lack of balconies on the facade, the flats at the entrance had much larger windows than the rest. The balconies too changed from one floor to the next. Those of the second floor extended outward in a semicircle, while the balconies on the third floor were buried so far inside the building one could easily sit in the apartments without worrying about being seen from the outside. Instead of an iron railing, the sides of the balconies on the fourth floor had been surrounded by a stone wall adorned with floral reliefs and two large marble flower pots on either end. So striking were the differences that one could not help but think the residents of the building shared the same space without living in the same place. In front, the relief between the windows of the first and second floors was particularly eye-catching. Here, placed within a circle, was a small-headed, large-bodied peacock. The 5 feathers of the peacock, one on top, two to the left and two to the right, pointed in 5 different directions. Suitably large eyes were drawn at the tips of the feathers, and the eyes in turn were adorned with thin, puny lines resembling eyelashes. Contrary to the feathers, one heading to the sky and the other 4 in 4 separate directions, the head of the peacock was bent down at the spot on the tip of its feet, which it looked towards, embroidered within an oval frame and barely visible from the street were the first letters of the names of the husband and wife. "What will you name it?" he asked when he showed her the apartment building with pride. A jasmine-scented offshore breeze sweetly blew in between them and gave voice to things Pavel Pavlovich Antipov could not express. "Agrippina, here is your baby with eyes the color of ashes. She'll always love you very much, but will not expect in return more love than you are capable of giving. She'll solely and completely be yours, but will not demand dedication from you. Never will she fuss, cry, get sick or die. Nor will she ever grow up. She'll not abandon you as long as you do not leave her. She'll be referred to as whatever you say. What name will you give your baby?" Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova listened with excitement to what the offshore breeze murmured. She remained pensive for a moment and then, with a spark in her eyes, exclaimed, "Bonbon." Pavel Pavlovich Antipov stared at his wife, puzzled. Then he must have concluded that she had not understood what they were talking about, for he repeated the question, this time adding in a few suggestions himself. She could choose names that alluded to their motherland, or a word that would remind them of the Istanbul of the 1920s, as a tribute to those days. Or, even better, she could select names that could demonstrate how very different their second arrival in the city had been from the first. Triumph would be highly befitting, for instance, as would pride, blessed, zenith, memory, escapade, or saga. It could just as well be the forget-me-not apartment, the reuniting, the placating, or the appeasing. There were hundreds of meaningful names with which they could crown their success, and should indeed do so, since there was so much effort, suffering, and also money behind it. Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova listened to her husband's soliloquy with a docile smile, but each time her response remained the same. When Pavel Pavlovich Antipov and Agrippina Fyodorovna Antipova moved into flat number 10 of Bonbon Palace on September 1, 1966, the entire sky was filled with plump, lead-colored clouds. The whole world had assumed the same insipid tone, as if God had run out of bonbons with colored wrappers. After giving the flat a cursory look over, Agrippina, trailed by her Algerian maid and the sullen Alsatian companion, headed directly to the balcony. She opened the double-paneled door and stepped out. The city was spread out right in front of her. It had changed, and how? She looked at Istanbul with the malicious pleasure of a woman who years later encounters the rival whose beauty she once secretly envied, now aged, decrepit, and shriveled. Then a strong northeast wind blew, her own image confusedly crossed her mind, and her eyes became misty, but she still continued to smile. At that moment, Pavel Pavlovich Antipov watched from afar with pleasure the smile that had settled on his wife's face. She looked so content. There, it had been worth it, worth returning to this city after all this time. Men, especially those like Pavel Pavlovich Antipov who expect life's uncertainties to confirm their truths, relish in the satisfaction of their women as proof of their own success. Looking at his wife that Istanbul night, as a strong northeast wind replaced the jasmine-scented offshore breeze of the past few days, Pavel Pavlovich Antipov too felt proud of himself. Time proved Pavel Pavlovich Antipov right. His wife died before him. The Alsatian companion and the Algerian maid returned to France soon thereafter. Yet Pavel Pavlovich Antipov did not go anywhere. After losing Agrippina, he lived alone in flat number 10 of Bonbon Palace for another 2 years. When he died, he was neither a year more nor less than 100 years old. In 1972, Bonbon Palace was inherited by Pavel Pavlovich Antipov's daughter, born out of wedlock, Valerie Germain, who lived in a large house in the Paris countryside with her husband and 4 children, the last of which she had given birth to when 40, did not attend the funeral of her father, whose presence had been nothing but an echoless void for her. Not only did she not visit the grave where he was laid next to Agrippina, she also remained equally indifferent to this unexpected inheritance. Neither then nor later did she feel the need to come and see the building, renting out all the flats with the aid of a rather greedy but just as competent Turkish real estate agent and managing the business from afar. She did not interfere with anything as long as money was regularly deposited into her bank account. Less than 3 weeks after she had rented out flat number 10, however, she received a letter gracefully penned in proper French. It was from the tenant. She was informing her that the personal belongings of Pavel Pavlovich Antipov and his wife were still there. Since the furniture was rather large in quantity and value, she indicated, it would be worthwhile for the owner to come and see things for herself. However, if this was not possible, she could find a shipping company to transport it all to France and help with the arrangements. In her response, Valerie Germain thanked the tenant for concern she had shown and expressed her sorrow for having inadvertently caused such trouble, but then indicated in no uncertain terms that she was not interested in receiving any of the mentioned items. Her tenant could choose among these any she wanted to keep for herself, to use them as she saw fit, or dispense them to others. She could then throw the rest in the garbage. The decision was hers. Of course, if any expense would be incurred in moving the furniture out of the house, she was ready to deduct it from the rent. Another letter arrived soon after. The woman in flat number 10 stated that she could not bring herself to throw the belongings into the garbage, and that she believed her landowner would agree with her if and when she saw the furniture herself, volunteering to safekeep them for her until then. She had attached to the end of her letter a list of 180 items, describing each and every one in detail. Also included in the letter was a black and white photograph. It was a picture of Bonbon Palace, probably taken by Pavel Pavlovich Antipov right after the construction was completed, but before anyone had moved in. The apartment building appeared colorless and soulless in the picture. There was not a single person in it, neither on its windows or balconies, nor on the sidewalks or the streets. It resembled a child of war with no living relatives and no eyes to watch her lonely growth. It looked equally placeless. One could not get a clue about what the city surrounding it, if there was one, looked like. It could be anywhere in the world and of any time other than the present. Valerie Germain liked this picture. For a long time she kept it posted on her refrigerator along with shopping lists, invoices to be paid, calorie counts, food recipes, vacation postcards, and the pictures her children had drawn. Then, the children grew up. Her age advanced and she lost the picture of Bonbon Palace sometime, somewhere.
And today. Flat number 3, hairdressers Simul and Silul. Oh God, what wrong have we done to deserve the smell? We literally live in garbage. It won't be long before we start scrabbling around like roosters. It was none other than Simul uttering these words, and whenever Simul said anything at the beauty parlor, female laughter, some genuine, others out of politeness, would immediately follow. That, however, was not the case this time. On the contrary, as soon as he stopped, a heavy silence descended upon the place. Here such pure silences were rare as rubies. For silence to occur, the cessation of many street sounds had to miraculously coincide. These included the ear-splitting horns of the cars turning down Cabal Street to avoid the traffic jam of the avenue, only to clog the road here too, and the yelling of both the watermelon vendor at his stand on the corner and his competitor circling the neighborhood in the rundown pickup truck, whose loudspeaker could be heard from the same place every 20 minutes. Not forgetting the shrieks of the children filling up the hole in the wall playground squeezed in between the apartment buildings, comprising of 2 swings, 1 seesaw and a rickety sheet iron slide that when heated up in the sun burnt the bottoms of those sliding on it. All of these parties had to agree among themselves to concurrently hush, since the sources of noise inside the beauty parlor were just as plentiful as those in the world outside, for a true silence to rule even for a short period of time. Here too, a number of highly extraordinary events had to happen. The television in the corner, which was constantly on and always showing the same music channel, had to fall silent even if only for a moment, a chance event that could only happen during the few minutes when either the lights went out, kicking in the generator, or one of the customers sat on the remote control by mistake. The bellowing air from the small hairdryers, the monotonous hum of the large dryers placed on each customer's head like the transparent turban of a grand vizier, the constantly bubbling samovar in the kitchen, the mechanical hum of the ceiling fan, the crackle of the aluminum folios wrapped on one by one to color and highlight streaks of hair, the splashing water when it was time to wash the hair, the nagging of the customer who found the water put on her hair suddenly either too hot or too cold, the itchy feeling buzz of the manicure file upon the nails, the sizzling of the wax emanating from the body hair removal room, the rustling of the broom and duster brought out continually to sweep the shorn hair, and the chats ebbing or flowing with the inclusion of new participants, often never to be concluded or completed, for there to be a genuine silence in the beauty parlor. All these had to simultaneously stop and stay this way. Of course, on top of it all, Simul would have to stop talking. However, the world is full of miracles. At least Bonbon Palace is. All of a sudden lumpy clouds of silence of unknown origin crowded into the room through the wide open windows and, like a muffler, softly spread onto all the sources of noise. In that flawless silence, Silul, the second hairdresser in the salon, sighed gratefully. He had never liked the uproar and commotion or the noisy chatter that went on day and night, but there was nothing he could do about it. After all, the one who triggered this wearisome katzenjammer he had to suffer all day long was none other than his twin, born of the very same egg as he had been. Simul talked so much. He always had a desire to talk, and also a topic to talk about. He chatted with the customers all day long, not minding his broken accent in Turkish, which he still had not been able to get rid of, kept an eye on the television to vilify every single music clip, incessantly scolded the apprentices, eavesdropped on others' conversations to put in his 2 cents worth, and he did all these things, not in any particular order but all at once. Still Silul could not get angry at him. Like many who believe their younger siblings' childhood to have been more difficult than theirs, Celil nurtured a tender love toward his 3.5 minutes younger brother. The twins had been separated when they were children. Celil had stayed in the village with his mother, in a suffocating yet affectionate, limited yet protected womb, always where he belonged, within his own roots. Semel, on the other hand, had gone to Australia with his father, uninhibited yet unshielded, in a boundless but entirely solitary universe, communicating with an estranged language, always half-settled, half-nomadic. Upon Semel's unexpected return to Turkey, their harshly parted paths had crossed once again after a youth spent apart. Their relatives had all presumed that the reason behind this sudden return could be nothing but homesickness and had therefore forgiven Semel for not coming back years ago to attend his mother's funeral. The truth is, the state of affairs in a country always tinkers with the perceptions of its citizens. The natives of less developed countries love to love those who, after spending years in a developed country and despite having the option to remain there, come instead to live with them. As soon as he had returned to Istanbul, Semel too had benefited from that distinctive love reserved for those such as Christians who convert to Islam, foreigners who settle in Turkey, tourists who spend their vacations here every year, and above all, Western brides married to Turks who are willing to bestow Turkish names to their children. Be that as it may, Semel actually considered Australia his country and did not much like either Turkey or the Turks, especially Turkish women. With their narrow shoulders, generous hips and frames they let carelessly widen. From top to toe, each one was a small, unkempt pair. Besides which, they were so conservative about their hair. Always the same colors, the same cuts. He had not yet met a Turkish woman who would ask for her hair to be cut as short as a man's. It was so strange for those who could not tolerate the presence of even a single hair on their bodies to not be able to come into have their hair cut short. Oh, no, Semel was not happy to be here. The only reason he did not pack up and leave this very moment was because he knew too well that his twin was effectively nailed down in Turkey. Indeed, Semel was in Turkey for the sake of his remaining half, the person whose name he had been separated from by a single letter of the alphabet, the resolute breach in his highly irresolute soul. If only he could tear him away from this country. Semel thought he would surely take his twin to Australia. However, as he could sense deep down that Celil would not come with him, and even if he did, could not survive anywhere other than his own country, Semel had no other alternative than to gather all his belongings and savings, and after all these years come to settle in Istanbul. As for Celil, though he would never be able to confess this to anyone, a deep distress had enveloped him the moment he had been reunited with his twin. Standing at the international airport terminal, he had stared, first with astonishment and then embarrassment, at the curly-haired, large-nosed, big-bellied man running to him with open arms and cries of ecstasy. His outfit was completely bizarre, a t-shirt adorned with kangaroos, a legume green pair of shorts, and those leather sandals that thrust his pink, hairy, ugly feet into plain sight, and his movements hugely vivacious. He made dozens of gestures just to say a single word, forever running into people and knocking things over. That he was so garrulous himself was hardly surprising. He made whopping promises that they would never again be parted, squealing with tears in his eyes about ridiculous plans and, damn it, never shutting up. If one took the things he said seriously, it seemed as if he wanted to use the money he had brought along as capital in a joint endeavor. Amidst the bare hugs and gluey kisses, he had waved his arms left and right like an inexperienced tightrope acrobat trying to regain his balance to stay on the Rope, yelling in the middle of the airport, "Here are the magnificent twins." It doesn't really matter what we do, so long as we don't part again. If we make it, we'll do so together. If we perish together. Speaking of perishing, Sealul in his embarrassment had felt like he had already started the process and silently wished that, if disappearing from the airport was not a feasible option, he could disappear from the face of the earth. Instead, all he could do was to watch with deep astonishment and even deeper distress this utterly unfamiliar and stranger than a stranger, exact replica of his. Though Sealul was far from being the type to plunge into risky businesses, his twins' excitement must have softened his heart, for he could not put up much resistance. When it was time to figure out what common job they could find, a startling fact awaited them. During the time they had been apart and entirely unaware of what the other was doing, they had, albeit for different reasons and through separate venues, undertaken the same profession. Sealul was a hairdresser and Seamul had also spent years in a unisex haircutting salon. The coincidence had instantly doubled Seamul's unrestrained exuberance. Twin hairdressers, he had shouted with pride, and then, as if stating something different, had echoed himself with even bigger excitement. Hairdresser twins. Looking at the contentment on his face, one imagined that each and every item on his wish list had been granted, while his sluggish brother kept calculating the pluses and minuses of opening a beauty parlor. Seamul had already taken the plunge and started to look for a place, but he did not have a clue what sort of a city Istanbul was. Did not seem to trouble him at all as he rushed to find a place by himself, and before the week was over he had already rented a flat, paying 1 year's rent in advance. It was an apartment in one of the many illegally constructed buildings on the steep plains overlooking the Bosphorus, with a wonderful view of the river. However, the moment Sealul saw the flat, he struggled in vain to explain to his twin that the panoramic view, which he could tell was the main reason his twin had rented the place, would mean nothing to their future customers. Still, they moved in and had no customers for months. Then heavy downpour started and the main room got flooded 4 times with water, and once by creatures which they guessed, from the traces left behind, were street cats. At the end of the 5th month, they finally scavenged, along with the money left over from Seamul's hasty investment, whatever soaked in cat hair covered furniture they could salvage, and decided to try once again. Only this time Sealul was to choose the place. After searching for a long time and carefully weighing all the choices under the present conditions, his choice was the flat on the garden floor of an ashen, fairly old and unkempt, but obviously once grandiose apartment building, located in a rather lively neighborhood on a well-trodden street that opened up to a busy avenue. "It's so odd, isn't it?" said Seamul on their first work day here. "I'm an incessant chatterer, but I went and found a place in a lifeless neighborhood." "You're always quiet, yet you chose such a noisy place." "So we're opposites. Not only of each other but of ourselves as well." Just the same, their opposing characters were not reflected in the 50 by 60 centimeter photograph, enlarged and framed right across the entrance. Upon Seamul's insistence, taken at the Marmara region 19th annual hairdressers competition that they had entered 3 years ago. On that day, despite the fact that Seamul had worn a t-shirt with carroty parrots on it and Sealul a matte olive green shirt, both had ended up competing with the same hair model and getting eliminated before the finals. The hairstyle they both liked the most involved a strand of copper red hair from the nape of the neck, being curled, thickly braided and loosely fastened into a bun. The similarity between the photographs of the two of them creating the same bun on different models at different times was startling. The customers loved to keep looking at the two photographs to try to locate the differences between them. One by one and over and over. Repetition is, after all, an intrinsic part of beauty parlors. They're everything, and everyone relentlessly keeps repeating themselves. Time, hurriedly chasing its own tail outside, gets chubby in here. As it slows down, like dirty gum stuck to the bottom of your shoe, time here lengthens when pulled, lengthens when pulled, lengthens. The best thing about repetition is familiarity. When surrounded by repetition, one feels safe and secure, as if in a well-known place amidst old buddies. Women's hairdressers owe their languor, a quality not usually welcome in any other workplace, to the constant turn of their wheel of repetition. Everything the customers do in here, not only have they certainly done many times before, but are also able to repeat infinite times in the future. Though all the beauty parlor catalogs are identical, each and every one still gets looked through again and again. The women's journals being passed around are never read. Until the end, they are just desolately thumbed instead. No one feels there is any harm in going back to the same sections again and again. The women in front of the mirror keep scrutinizing each other, keeping at it even though there is barely a change in the other person's appearance from one glance to the next. Newspapers are read not page by page but instead endlessly scanned. The tea they serve always remains half drunk, gets cold, is replenished, stays in the half-full cup, gets cold once again, the continuing chats get cut here and there, topics keep changing, the same things are talked about repeatedly, the same music videos appearing on television are watched in bits and pieces, the same singers and songs are subjected to scrutiny over and over again, to the same comments. Nothing has to be completed. Life is a series of perpetual repetitions with no beginning or ending. Though the world may have a bottom to reach and the judgment day a cutoff date, you can be sure that Israfil will not blow his sir while you are sitting in the beauty parlor. An earthquake can happen in Istanbul at any moment, any second, but definitely not while you are at the beauty parlor. Not in there. Distinguishing the differences between the two photographs on the wall was a recurring delight for the women customers. The female gaze has, after all, a predilection to identify differences before similarities. 4-3 seconds show a man the picture of 5 beautiful, young models in blue bathing suits and ponytails lined up by a pool. What he sees would probably be this: a ponytailed, young and highly good-looking model in a bathing suit. X5 then show the same picture to a woman. What she in turn sees would probably be X5 models by the pool, some with good postures, some not. Some carrying the ponytail well, others not, the blue bathing suit fitting the figures of some well, others not, some are more good-looking than others. Be that as it may, when it came to the photographs of Celal and Simul, taken at the Marmara region's 19th traditional hairdressers contest, even the female gaze would have a hard time detecting the nuances. Leaving aside their clothes and Simul's silver accessories, they were identical, right up to their facial expressions. From the way they leaned their heads sideways to the angle with which they bent over the models whose hair they fixed, from the way they crossed their eyebrows to emphasize how seriously they took what they were doing to how they bent their fingers. Still, there was a small difference that did not escape the eye. Simul lightly bit his lower lip. Perhaps because he knew he was not as good a hairdresser as his brother, or he was not as enamored with the thickly braided buns with the curled strand of copper red hair from the nape of the neck as he had thought. Alternatively, perhaps all he could think of at that moment was finishing up what he was doing so he could go and get something to eat. How Simul, with his infatuation with food and his non-stop consumption of all sorts of pastries, since returning to Turkey, managed to maintain exactly the same figure as Seelal, who ate as little as a bird and basically survived on soup, was a mystery even the regular customers of the beauty parlor did not think they could ever solve. Yet the similarities between the twins came to an end when you considered the style with which each executed the many tasks that their jobs involved. It was due to this that Seemal's customers differed from those of Seelal. Of course, it did happen that on certain days, a particular customer preferred one twin to their usual choice of the other. Even those who loved to shoot the breeze with Seemal made sure at certain times that Seelal fixed their hair. When it came to significant days like engagements, weddings, celebrations, and other important appointments, the preference of all customers was for Seelal. In addition to the special occasions, he was also the unerring choice for emergency situations. Those who had messed around with their hair at home and ended up with it scruffily cut, looking lightning-struck due to a cheap perm, turned into a bird's nest, dyed the color of corn tassel when attempting to lighten with bleach or dried out for following word of mouth. Folk remedies, hair done in the morning, hated at night, sacrificed to the careless experiments of novice hairdressers, all of these disasters were delegated to Seelal's adroit hands. In such difficult situations his even temperament that was not at all like his brother's went into effect, enabling him to calm down even the most distressed of customers. It was unanimously agreed that there couldn't be any hair in so calamitous condition that he could not save it. There was never a problem between the brothers concerning which of them should look after which customers. An unspoken agreement reigned here as well. No one took offense as long as the accepted distribution of roles remained intact. Most of the time they would understand what a woman's concern was within the first 2 minutes after she had entered through the door, and they would greet her accordingly. If the arriving customer blundered in roughly enough to make the chimes on the door jangle, and with a hopeless look on her face, Seelal would greet her, gauging the size of the problem awaiting him all the while. Whereas it would be Seemal's turn to welcome in customers whose situations were less of an emergency. He would stop the conversation he would most probably be having and bend down to greet the customer with levels of politeness which he could never get right, never forgetting, if the person was an acquaintance, to throw in a few reproachful words about how long it had been since they last saw her. If it were up to Seemal, he would require every woman to spend at least an hour every day at the beauty parlor. Yet there was one person who had from the very beginning had her hair done exclusively by Seelal, someone who relished the silence that had just descended in the salon as much as he did Madame Auntie. This tiny, elderly woman living alone on the top floor of Bonbon Palace at flat number 10 came once every 2 weeks without fail to have her thin, sparse hair trimmed and, once a month, colored platinum yellow. That specific color, however, had become a source of worry to the hearts and a balm to the tongues of the regular customers of the beauty parlor. They thought she was too old for platinum yellow, or else platinum yellow was too much for her age. She was 78 years old, certainly an inappropriate age to be a blonde. Given that she still chose to be blonde, it was considered that she should at least wipe off that serious look, not be so grave or such a model of dignity. If she was instead a witty, at least a little goofy, garrulous and cheerful old woman with eyes twinkling the traces of the bohemian life she had once led, paying no heed to moral prohibitions or to what anyone said, then her hair would have been appropriate. Yet here she was, as far removed from being a slacker as a proper granny, as straight as if she had been drawn by a ruler, as heavy as cast metal, and, to top it all, platinum blonde. That was simply too much for the regular customers of the beauty parlor. It was too much because, in the coded world of colors and hair colors, the rules are clear-cut. Yellow has little to do with respectability. A blonde woman can pierce through this rule on only one condition: if she is a genuine blonde. Originality is a problem peculiar to blondes. The brunettes, red heads and albinos can have their hair colored as often as they like in as many different shades as they please, and yet never have to encounter 50 times a day the question as to whether this is indeed their natural color. The desire to be blonde makes women predisposed to be sly and forces them to lie. Yet their attempts at fraud are foiled very quickly. While they are busy convincing people, truth insidiously grins from their roots. Blondness makes the enthusiast dishonest and the genuine antisocial. Yet neither her hair color nor her wearing makeup at this age weakened the respect Madame Auntie awakened in those around her. It was evident from the first day that she, with her solemnity and taciturn nature, would be Cecil's customer and always remain so, if judged by the gleam in their eyes. Upon seeing each other, they got along fabulously, yet, given they rarely opened their mouths to utter a few words, it was hard to figure out how they had bonded. If it were up to them, words should have been rationed to people every month. Everyone should have known that words uttered are like drinking water in tilled soil, a scarce resource, and whenever one spoke, they depleted their limited share. However, this afternoon the tranquility of this silence-loving pair could only last 4 minutes. Suddenly, the door was pushed, the bell jolted in accompaniment to the watermelon vendor's mechanical voice, which made him sound as if he was firing orders. A young woman entered the beauty parlor with quick yet unhurried steps. 3 indolent women, all Seymours customers, all with leopard-patterned plastic smocks tied to their necks and lined up next to one another on the swiveling chairs in front of the wall-length mirror, turned their heads with all the rollers, hairpins, hair caps, and aluminum folios to give the newcomer a once-over, looking from top to bottom. Upon realizing who she was, with a deeper curiosity, they eyed her up again, this time looking from bottom to top. This was a historic moment, for up until now the Blue Mistress had never set foot in the beauty parlor. Cecil stole a look at the door and went back to work. At that moment, he was interested in no hair other than the platinum yellow strands of his friend. Whoever this young woman might be, she did not look like his type of customer anyhow. Seymour, however, was neither as indifferent nor as ignorant as his twin. On the contrary, from the gossip lavishly dispensed at the beauty parlor from morning until dark, he had distilled ample information about the Blue Mistress. He knew, for instance, that she was only 22 years old. He had also heard how a couple of weeks ago, upon being harassed by a man at the entrance to their street, she had poured all the contents of the garbage bag she had taken out to dump over the head of her assailant. Furthermore, he was also informed that she had picked a fight with the exceedingly religious apartment manager, Haji, who, when dividing the apartment's joint water bill among all the flats according to the number of people residing in each unit, had prepared her invoice for not 1 but 2 persons. It was scarcely news to anyone that although the Blue Mistress had leased flat number 8 by herself, stating she would live alone, a sour-faced olive oil merchant old enough to be her father lived with her at least 4 days a week. Seymour knew all this and was dying to find out more. Turning over his highlighting brush to the pimpled apprentice, as he veered toward the door with a stuck-up smile on his face, he took a full-length shot of the unexpected visitor. You could hardly say that her body was great. Though not quite a pear, it was still pear-like. She was wearing a long gauzy dress with straps that covered up too much for a mistress. However, under the sunlight trickling through the glass door, her legs were entirely visible as she had not worn an underskirt. It looked as if she simultaneously wanted to hide and expose her body, or perhaps she was just confused, and her face. Her face was the most interesting part. Some people's faces are like magnets, covered with skin. All the ins and outs, ups and downs, core and gist of their personality reside there. They think with their faces, converse, promenade, quarrel, get hungry, feel happy, love or make love with their faces. Their bodies are necessary, albeit unimpressive pedestals, merely added on to carry their faces. Such people are essentially walking faces. Accordingly, they can never hide their feelings away. Whatever they feel gets reflected, totally and immediately, upon their faces. The petite, pale face of the blue mistress, adorned with an azure hisma, screamed out that, right at that moment, she was trying hard not to show her distress. Simul took a step toward her, and though this was not at all his habit, shook hands with the blue mistress, flagrantly violating women's hairdressers' custom of greeting customers like all repressed homosexuals who generally got along well with the delicate sex but also somewhat sneered at them. He too was particularly interested in those women who were partly envied, partly hated by other women. Trying to ignore the inquisitive, impish stares directed at her from different angles of the beauty parlor, the blue mistress moved with brisk, uncertain steps toward the swivel chair Simul pointed out to her. As she took her place in front of the long, wide mirror with other women, the looks directed at her folded into one another and multiplied. The blonde with a slight cast in her eye, the jittery chain-smoking brunette who kept shaking her pedicured toes with cotton pieces stuck in between each one, the short and plump ginger head sitting with two thick carroty lines on top of her eyes having her eyebrows colored along with her hair, and finally the elf-like elderly lady at the very corner, all stared at her as if waiting to be introduced. The pimpled apprentice tied the leopard-patterned, plastic smock with dubious stains onto the neck of the blue mistress, careful to touch her as little as possible. It was an agonizing misfortune for the apprentice to have to work at a beauty parlor at this sensitive stage of his life, hearing all sorts of obscene jokes from women about the way his face divulged the sins his hand must be committing at nights. As the teenage boy backed off with unsteady steps, he did not notice the cat that had without a sound snuck in through the open window. All eyes were turned toward the animal when it let out a mighty meow upon having its tail trampled. It was a thick-coated, grim-faced, strapping cat as black as tar, one of those that looked upon every human they saw with narrowed eyes as if there had been a bloody fight between cats and humans from time immemorial. Still, as the round strand of hair starting from the sides of its nose down under its chin looked as if someone had dipped it in a bowl of yogurt, it had a cute side in spite of everything. "Come, garbage! Come here, you nuisance!" Simul called out when he realized that the blue mistress was fond of the cat. "Why do you call the cat garbage?" asked the blue mistress. The animal had immediately sensed who to get attention from and started rubbing against her feet. The blue mistress grabbed it with her two hands and lifted it up, directing the same question this time to the cat in the sugary syrupy voice women use when admiring babies. "Why do they call you garbage? Tell me. Why, my beauty? How could one call such a beautiful cat garbage?" "Perhaps because this Mr. Garbage never leaves the garbage dump," Simul remarked with joy. Now that garbage provided a means for him to communicate with the blue mistress, it seemed cuter to Simul than ever. There is probably no other street cat in all of Istanbul as fortunate as this one. Not that he has an outstanding beauty, look at his face for God's sake. Have you ever seen a cat with such dirty looks? It is as if he was going to be a snake but could not find the appropriate skin. But he still finds a way to get people to like him. Does he have an irresistible charm or what? How does he manage to wrangle food out of whomever he visits? But do you think he'll be satisfied? Never. He eats his fill and then ends up in his kingdom, the garbage dump. I swear I would not have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. We had just rented this place, we're in the middle of the final preparations, dog-tired from working all day long and hungry like wolves. We decided to order food from the chicken place. You know how huge their portions are, don't you? Rice, salad, fried potatoes, all come heaped high. Well, let me cut to the chase. There was some mix-up and they had sent in extra chicken. We didn't return it as we thought we could eat that one as well. Of course, we couldn't. Everyone could barely finish what they had in front of them. Especially Silo, he pecked at it like a bird. As we were eating, guess who picked up the scent and showed up? I didn't know then that they called him garbage, but along he comes, begging food so desperately. You'd think the poor thing had been starving for days. So we put the extra chicken in front of him, and may the curse of God befall me if I'm lying, he gobbled that chicken down so ferociously you'd think a pack of Dobermans were chasing him. Not a single bone was left behind. Can you imagine? He devoured a plate of chicken heaped full right in front of our eyes. Back then, the cat prophet lived in flat number 2. Had you heard of him? Another nut. He had some 20, 30 cats. The whole place smelled of cat piss. Still, even that was better than the stink of this garbage. We were talking about that before you arrived. I was just saying to Silo, we live in so much garbage. We'll soon start to peck like roosters. Right, Silo? Silo shook his head in agreement. After all that he had wolfed down, this Mr. Garbage here went after the cat food of the cat prophet, but her tribe must have given him a sound beating, for he returned with his tail between his legs for our leftovers. We put out the fried potatoes, which he pretended not to like much, but he finished them off all the same. At that point we all stopped working to watch the animal we placed bets on when he was going to explode. Not only the women lined up by the mirror, but also the manicurist and the apprentices who had heard this story at least 40 times were all ears, listening to Simul. He may not have been as fine a hairdresser as his brother, but when it came to garrulousness, he beat everyone hands down. His linguistic aptitude was amazing. If he were picked up from here and dropped off in a country he could not even place on a map, he would learn their language in a flash just to be able to understand what was being spoken around him and then put in his 2 cents worth. Likewise, in just 5 years, he had been able to repair his Turkish, which had lost its luster during the long years he spent in Australia, and had polished it brand new. The only problem was his telltale accent. However, Silo was not certain as to whether his 3.5 minutes younger brother actually failed to get rid of his accent or deliberately kept it intact, thinking the customers liked it more this way. He ate and ate, then got up stretching. The animal had turned into a giant stomach. He couldn't even walk, dragging along that tummy. We dashed after him, following him outside, where he jumped on the wall of the side garden, and what a jump! He had become so heavy that his belly got caught, and he almost fell down. We thought he would curl up somewhere and sleep for at least 2 days. No way. Instead, he leaped to the other side of the wall. You know those garbage bags they leave there? Alas, we live in a garbage dump. Anyway, this one had found a bunch of fish heads. I honestly have no idea what else he could have eaten that day. We felt sick as we watched him. You know, I swear I have been frightened of this cat ever since that day. We've heard a lot about cats who eat their owners when hungry, but this garbage here, he could gobble all of us down even when full. What's more, I bet he would polish it all off with what he finds in the garbage. I swear he's understood all we've been saying about him, exclaimed the plump gingerhead with a frozen face, afraid of getting wrinkles on her forehead if she laughed. Let him understand. Is it all lies? He has a trash can instead of a stomach. Hence the name, garbage, grumbled Seymour as he shook the hairdryer in his hand towards the cat, carefully watching him behind narrowed eyes. The hairdryer. Knowing that being subjected to the breath of this howling monster was worse than falling into a bucket full of water, the cat took off in a blink from the lap of the blue mistress and leapt onto the open window. After staying there for an instant to give those in the beauty parlor a final and unhappy once over, he jumped towards the nearest empty space like a stuffed toy filled with swagger instead of stuffing. However, before his paws reached the garden, something weird landed on his head, a cerulean child's dress, adorned with many tiny mermaid figures ruffled all around in a starched collar, which descended like a dry leaf or a piece of paper with an almost surreal slowness from the top floor of Bonbon Palace, for approximately 5 seconds, landing just moments away from the soil right on top of the cat who had cut across its path. Both landed on the ground at the same time. Oh, look, look! It's raining clothes from above, shouted the manicurist in excitement, having been rummaging through the shelf in front of the window to find the number 113 burgundy nail polish. Seymour, the plump gingerhead, the blonde with a slight cast in her eye, and the apprentices all dashed over to the window in an instant. A little later, upon their insistence, the blue mistress came also with reluctant steps, and the jittery brunette limped over, trying not to step on her pedicured feet. Clothes were indeed raining from above, children's clothes in all types and colors. Judging by the crowd of 8 to 10 people gathered on the sidewalk, there were other spectators of this unexpected show. All had turned their heads up and were fixated on a single point, trying to see the person throwing the clothes. Yet the perpetrator of the incident refused to reveal themselves. Just a naked, unadorned, snow-white woman's arm appeared at regular intervals from the window of the flat at the top floor of Bonbon Palace, on each appearance dropping yet another piece of clothing. As the clothes rained down one after another, the manicurist stretched out of the window to catch the falling clothes with the happiness of someone trying to touch the first snow of the season. From among the dresses, socks, sweaters, shirts, pullovers, she managed to catch a resin yellow ribbon. "Don't do that, it's not proper," said Madame Auntie, who had maintained her composure through it all. Her lifeless voice raised and lowered like a knobby wall or a jagged piece of paper. The manicurist grumbled with the deep disappointment of being forced to be virtuous just as she had started to savor being witness to another person's insanity. With a long face, she threw the ribbon on top of the mound of clothes in the garden. It did not last long. After a minute or two, the rain of clothes stopped by itself. The concluding act of the show was a royal blue school uniform. Like some sort of koi parachute, it opened up to land quietly on top of its predecessors. The windows of the top floor were noisily shut, and the snow-white arm retreated inside. As the spectators on the sidewalk Dispersed one by one, the ones inside returned to their places as well. "Sonny, make all of us coffee," said Seymour to the apprentice without. "Pimples. God knows, our nerves are on edge." He collapsed onto the large couch, suddenly feeling exhausted. "We're sick of it. Ever since we moved in here, things have been raining on our heads. The cracked woman has not left a thing in the house. She opens the windows whenever she loses her temper. And whoosh, whatever there is comes down. One of these days she's going to throw down a TV set or something like that, and whichever one of us gets it in the head will die for nothing." Though he remained pensive for a moment, it would not take Seymour long to collect himself together. He was always somewhat scared of sadness settling in with no palpable reason. So inventive. Never have I seen her throwing the same thing twice. "Cecil, do you remember, she once threw down her husband's ties and they remained stuck on the rose acacia tree for days." A hearty response from his brother being one of the last things he expected to get at this moment. Seymour turned not to him but the customers instead. Cecil got out and brought the ties down. He didn't let the young ones out, fearing they'd break the branches of the rose acacia. He climbed himself. Had it not been for him, the stupid man's ties would have been hanging out 4 days. Cecil smiled with a visible distress. "I hope someone will gather the clothes up. It's getting dark, God knows someone could steal them," he mumbled to escape being the focus of the conversation. "She's gathering them up. The new cleaning lady is down there gathering all of them up. What a shame," the poor woman is red with embarrassment as if she'd thrown them down herself, blurted out the manicurist. "It won't be long. This one will soon quit as well," mumbled the jittery brunette as she puffed away, examining the permanently waved strands of hair that had started to appear from under the thin rollers that the apprentice with the pimples had started to undo. "Oh, can any cleaning lady survive Taijin? Whoever comes runs away," remarked Seymour. "Hygiene Taijin. Hygiene Taijin," giggled the blonde with a cast in her eye. "The woman hasn't stepped out of her house for exactly 4 months. Can you imagine? She hasn't been able to go outside for fear of catching a disease. She's utterly mad these days." "Come on, what do you mean by these days, for God's sake?" "Those who are in the know will tell it straight. She's always been nuts. Madam Aunties. Known them since day one." "Isn't it so, Madam Auntie?" shouted the manicurist. Like many of her peers, she too felt the need to raise her voice when talking to an elderly person. All heads turned to the old woman. Actually, no one knew why she was called Madam Auntie. Neither had they hitherto wondered whether she was Muslim or not, though if asked, chances are they would affirm that she was a Muslim and a Turk just like everyone else. The reason they could not help but call her Madam was not because they had any doubts about her religion or citizenship, they just felt deep down that she was different, though they were unable to explain why. It was not because she was so advanced in years, though she certainly was, or because her manners were unusual, though they certainly were, that she differed from others. Her oddness was less visible and yet was easily detectable, since her nature little resembled that of the others. Madam she remained. Besides, having been here for so many years, she had much older roots than anyone else. She was the only one among them who was born and raised in Istanbul. While most of the neighbors were immigrants, her entire life had been spent in this neighborhood. Unlike the others, she had not popped up out of nowhere, turning her back to a future that never came and a past that was never left behind. Here she was, neither dragged along by others nor having dragged others behind her. Her name was Auntie because her very being was a residue of a past none of them had lived. Madame Auntie lowered her head with a withered smile. She looked at her blue, purple and burgundy hands with brown spots drizzled over them. The same spots, only smaller and more faded, had been randomly sprinkled from her temples to her cheeks. If these had been the loudest colors on her skin, she would have looked, like many women her age, too old to age further. Yet, the orange of her lipstick that seemed less spread on than glued on, the sunny yellowness of her leaf-shaped gold earrings, the rouge on her cheeks that made the concentric wrinkles stand out line by line, the purple tones of eye shadow that collected on her eyelids layer upon layer, the navy, blue and gray twinkle of her turquoise eyes, and then of course, the platinum yellow of her hair, had opened up wayward passageways to the unknown, behind her far from somber appearance. Her putting on so much makeup regardless of her age had bestowed upon her a grand ridiculousness. Like all grandly ridiculous people, she too had a scary side. As such, she was a livewire that added extra spark to all chats. When she was around, it was hard to talk behind people's backs or get any pleasure from the art of slander or exaggeration, but the opposite was also true. The air of sobriety of Madame Auntie made the women in the beauty parlor recall the mixed pleasure they had last tasted during their high school years when they took a common stand against a very righteous teacher, while craving to impress her at the same time. Their convoluted chats were tidied up so that they reached the right consistency as they trod around and penetrated from many directions the principles she voiced and the values she defended. In addition, the pleasure they received multiplied when they were at times able to include her in their aspirations. For great is the pleasure of drawing the pure to slovenly ways, to then see how they are like everyone else, worth only as much. The plump brunette must have felt the same, for she could not resist. She backed the manicurist in a collective attempt to convince the old woman. They say Hygiene Taijin was no different as a young girl, but definitely got worse after getting married. She's a hygiene freak. Come on, is that so bad? She's just a fastidious woman, objected Madame Auntie, making an effort to put the matter behind them. Auntie, this isn't fastidiousness, it's an illness, shouted the manicurist, with the courage pumped into her from the reinforcements. Maybe even worse. When you're ill, you know it. You go to the physician and get treated. Right? There's no cure for hygiene freaks. If there was one, Mrs. Taijin wouldn't put it in her mouth. She'd find it too filthy. What a shame. Her child suffers the most, said the blonde with the one eye cast. Don't say that, muttered Madame Auntie. Taijin dotes on her daughter. How can a mother possibly want any harm to come to her child? Fine, Madame Auntie, but what kind of a love can we understand from it? Look, she threw down all of the poor kid's clothes, yelled the manicurist. Really? Uttered Madame Auntie in astonishment. The manicurist exclaimed with the thrill of having finally said something. The old woman could not object to, of course, all those clothes raining upon our heads belong to that poor kid. See that she doesn't throw out her own clothes. The woman is nutty but not insane. She's perfectly sane when it suits her interests. The old woman puckered her thin lips with suspicion. Really, so she threw out the child's clothes. Why, I wonder? Why do you think? Because she's nutty. Madame Auntie's face darkened. Realizing she had gone too far, the manicurist hushed, nonetheless pleased that she had said all she wanted to say. Oh, what's it to us? If she's nutty, so be it, roared Seymour. Though enjoying the gossip, he was worried the manicurist's idle talk would bother the old woman and so anger Seal'll. Are we to bother with the troubles of every nutter? Is there anything more in Istanbul other than nutters? Here we see lots of them, as many as Bulgar. If we talk about each one of them, we'll do so until the end of our lives. Sonny, what happened to the coffees? Bring them here, we're parched. In an attempt to change the topic, Seal'll intervened. This garbage smell has increased again. We complained to the municipality so many times. It didn't help at all. What did they say? They said they've turned the garbage collection business over to a private company, added Seymour instantly, always fond of completing the half-uttered sentences of his twin. Then we found the company's phone number. They too are bores. They send the truck out right in the middle of rush hour when people are on their way back from work, as if out of spite. They do come and collect the garbage regularly, though at the wrong hour. Alas, however, we still haven't been able to get rid of this smell, summed up Seal'll. Of course we can't get rid of it. With so much Bulgar around, we can be rid of neither garbage nor cultural backwardness. Seymour said heatedly. Now can you believe it, Madam Auntie? We spend our days scolding the people who leave their garbage by this wall. All the ignorant, illiterate women in this neighborhood leave their garbage by our garden wall and always the same types, so pig-headed. I'm tired of repeating it. There's one in particular you especially don't want to know about. The woman's house is right at the end of the street. She doesn't mind, she walks 300 meters every day to dump her garbage here. I long pondered why on earth someone would do such a thing. I finally came up with an explanation. There was probably a field here long before this apartment building was constructed. Back then, this woman's grandmother would dump her garbage here. Eventually, that woman had a daughter, and when that one was grown up, she too would always dump her garbage at the same place. Then she too had a daughter. That's the Bulgar I have a row with every one of God's days. Their interest in garbage is hereditary, passes from mother to daughter. A type of family tradition. Mind you, what could she do? She's just continuing whatever she has seen. But unlike her ancestors, she doesn't pour it out of a pail, she puts it in a plastic bag first. A modern Bulgar. While the others laughed and Seymour grumbled, Madame Auntie shook her head deep in thought. But Seymour, she said, this place wasn't a field in the past. Underneath this entire neighborhood are graveyards. Not at all prepared for such an objection, Seymour swallowed back all the words that were getting ready to leave his tongue. As he looked around him, in distress as if for help, he was waylaid by a teeny-tiny, constantly moving shadow at the bottom of the counter in front of the mirror. It was a cockroach. It had climbed the basket of rollers, moving his antenna as if listening to the chat. Good thing it had not yet attracted anyone's attention. However, if it decided to get out of the basket and walk along the counter, it would shortly be parading in front of each and every customer. Seymour grabbed the large bristle hairbrush and approached sideways in a crab walk at the same time, talking even more excitedly so as not to let on. Look here, woman. I say, do I come and dump my garbage on your carpet? With what right can you leave your garbage on someone else's wall? Wait for the garbage truck to come at night, then you can take it outside your own door and the garbage men would pick it up. No, she doesn't understand at all, because of that Bulgar I tell you. What bulgur? Asked the blue mistress, popping her head up from the third-page news where she was hiding from the constant looks of the apprentice with the pimples. Oh, don't you know my bulgur theory? Let me tell you right away, said Semel without taking his eyes off the cockroach. It's actually very simple. Now, is there population planning in Turkey? No. Oh, God gives them to you. So keep giving birth and let them loose onto the streets. Okay, let's say you let them loose, but how are you going to feed so many kids? One person you feed with meat, 5 people with meat and bulgur, 10 with only bulgur. Okay. Is this bulgur beneficial to human intelligence? No. You can then keep on telling the woman as many times as you want. Come on, sister, don't dump your garbage in my garden. I keep on hollering. She stupidly stares at my face. Then the following day at the same time she comes again and dumps. Again, as if wound up like a watch. She doesn't understand, how could she? With the brains of bulgur? Silo coughed clumsily. Semel had received the message, but preferring the interest of the blue mistress over the political correctness of his twin, he did not back down. Just this past month I personally confronted this woman. It was an afternoon like this one, late, we were fixing a bride's hair. The bride was on one side, the relatives of the bride on the other, the bun of one was finished. And the other one had just been started. We'd been up all day long, totally beat. I looked outside and saw this woman coming again wobbling with garbage bags in her hand. I opened the windows, stuck my head out, waiting. Maybe she'll be embarrassed when she sees me and go back, I thought. No way. This creature of God came looking right into my eyes and still threw down her garbage. Oh, if I could only understand. Who declared our garden wall a dump? Who told these people, come throw your garbage in front of your neighbor's house? The apprentices could barely hold me back. I was going to tear the woman to pieces. I lost it, I was hollering, hurling insults. You'd think a person would be a little embarrassed and at least feel reluctant. In front of all the people, right? Guess again. She stares at my face with a stupid naivety. I swear to God she didn't even understand why I was angry. She must have thought I'd escaped from a mental institution. Even if she doesn't understand, she'd probably be afraid to come again, I said to myself. Yet didn't she come again at the same time with the garbage in her hand? There she was, eyes wide open, fixed in an idiotic stare to see what I was going to do. She'll make a murderer out of me. Oh my beautiful God, one doesn't meddle in your business, but why on earth do you create such people? Now what do we have to do to these bulgur? I don't know. Because of them. The apartment building is thick with the smell of garbage. The way things are going, no one will come in here. We'll lose our jobs, our daily bread. Child. Spray a bit, okay? The sweet sugary perfume of the spray, with the picture of a deserted shore, shadowed by palm trees and a turquoise sea, rained in particles on all corners of the shop and mixed with all the various smells. Semel stole a glance at the cockroach in the hope that it would be poisoned by the room spray. However, not only was it not at all affected by the particles landing on it had even succeeded in climbing up to the top of the pile of rollers and was now getting ready to move on to the brilliantine box next to it. God knows you're right, all your customers would run away, the high-strung brunette jumped in, as she watched the number 113 burgundy nail polish that had already dried on her toes now being put on her fingers. Of course you've grown accustomed to the smell because you're here all day. long. Sometimes when I enter this apartment building, I feel suffocated by it. The windows are wide open all day long, the breeze blows pleasantly. And still the smell does not go away. They say it increases as you go up to the higher floors. Is that so, Madam Auntie? Shouted the manicurist, causing the nail polish to overflow. And the Bulgars across from us claim we take their garbage. Now look. Here, are you crazy? What would I do with your disgusting garbage? Simul intervened and looked sharply at the manicurist so she would understand his discomfort about her asking questions of the old woman at every opportunity. How so? What does that mean? Asked the blue mistress, taking a break from bemoaning her new image that had just started to appear on the mirror. Like many other women who witness even just the trimming of their hair, they had tried so hard to grow long, she too had already started to feel remorse, even before getting up from the swivel chair. Oh, don't you know we're in dispute with the nutters at number 4? And I thought there wasn't a person left who hadn't heard about it. Simul said. One day these people came and welcome. I said, for why else does someone come to the beauty parlor? I thought they'd come to have their hair done, but apparently that wasn't their intention. This crazy woman in front, her stark raving mad husband behind her, their old maid older daughter next to them, and the other old maid younger daughter behind them, all 4 of them were standing in front of me, out on a family campaign. First I didn't understand a thing from what they said. It turned out they'd tied up their garbage bags and placed them in front of their door, and when they looked 5 minutes later, their garbage wasn't there. Where's our garbage? They said. Miriam might have picked it up, I suggested. No sir, the janitors had gone to their village that day. The garbage men might have picked it up, I said. What sort of a garbage man would enter the apartment building? They retorted. How would I know where your garbage is? They obstinately maintained. You took it, give our garbage back. What luck! Of all the places in Istanbul, we opened up a beauty parlor in an apartment building full of nutters. Absorbed in talking, Simul suddenly realized he had moved away from his prey. Though he turned around, scrutinizing the situation warily, the cockroach was nowhere to be found. For goodness sake, whoever took the garbage bag, took it. What's the big deal? Muttered the high-strung brunette, lighting a new cigarette. Hey, the incident isn't as frivolous as you think, stated Simul as he looked under, around and in the vicinity of the basket of rollers. The man's a paranoiac. His wife is even worse. Who knows what scenarios they invented in their heads? Something like the CIA took the garbage bags, or the terrorists kidnapped them. This was on the tip of my tongue, but I swallowed it. Now, look here, who do you think you are to imagine you might have your garbage stolen? How sad. Being a poor Bulgar but thinking yourself a blessing like beans. The pimpled apprentice started to collect the teacups accumulated on the counter, each stained by different colored lipsticks. As Simul stared fixedly at each teacup, fearing the cockroach would emerge from under one of the saucers, his apprentice looked at the nipples of the blue mistress with a gaze just as fixed. Since the blue mistress, finally rid of the plastic smock, was busy inspecting her new hair model, she was not aware of either the apprentice's looks or Simul's anxiety. If only she could muster enough courage to one day have her hair cut very short, but the olive oil merchant would most certainly not approve of such a change. Far too many times he had said he liked hair long in a woman. God knows he was going to complain a lot at her trimming her hair even this much. She looked at her watch. She was late, very late. She still had a lot of errands to run. Simul was standing right behind her with a bristle brush in his hand. She thought the anxiety on his face was due to her not liking the haircut, and because she wanted to please him and had also decided she should say her goodbye in the same way she had been greeted. She fervently shook his hand, violating the customer departure custom of a women's hairdresser. The blue mistress's hand had still not left Simul's when the outside door opened harshly once again, as the bell shook mightily with the yell of the watermelon vendor at the corner, who now seemed determined to suppress his competitor with the loudspeaker. A woman plunged in, dripping with agitation all over. All heads in the beauty parlor once again turned to the door to see the new addition to their ranks. They looked and were left dumbstruck, as if frozen stiff by a new command. The door closed and the last remaining echo of the bell stopped by itself as it reached the rest with a puny sound. The new customer was none other than Hygiene Tijin. Flat number 1, Musa, Mariam, Mohammed. "No way, I won't go," shouted Mohammed from where he had squeezed into. He then pounded his fist, as if it were responsible for all this, on the closest of the velvet sofas, whose color had first been egg yolk yellow, next sour cherry burgundy, and then aquamarine, but now was ultimately a total mystery. Under these flowery covers, he would have preferred his kicks over fists, having lately made a habit of kicking everything he came across, but right at this instant the scrawny frame of his 6 years had been so tightly squeezed between the wall and the sofas that he was not even able to move his legs properly. Unable to free his body, he instead unleashed 2 of the longest barrages of swear words he knew, tying one onto the tail of the other. Upon hearing him swear again, Mariam * pushed with her feet all of the 3 sofas that were lined up and pinned her blasphemous son to the wall, in the meantime guarding her swollen belly with 2 hands. Now literally cornered, Mohammed turned red with anger and opened his mouth to swear anew, but did not dare go that far, as surrendering to his mother without resistance was a wound to his pride. He angrily bit the side of the sofa that had started to hurt his waist. The flowery cover protected the chair from all such outside pressures, but maybe he could leave teeth marks if he bit hard enough. The history of this scuffle that was repeated every weekday morning went back exactly 5 months and 1 week to the enrollment of Mohammed into the 1G section of the only elementary school in the neighborhood. All he could remember from the first day of school was the anxious mothers, distressed children's, and sulky teachers' faces. With time, the mothers' anxieties, the children's distress, and even the teachers' sulkiness had abated bit by bit, yet all these bits, instead of scattering away to eventually disappear, had altogether been transferred to Mohammed. Hence, after 5 months, 1 week to the day, Mohammed was an anxious, distressed, sulky child who still did not want to go to school. His starting school had coincided with his mother's sofa obsession. Around that time, Mariam had somehow heard that her cousin's son, who resided in an Aegean town by the coast and made a living by repairing boats, like his father and grandfather before him, had decided out of the blue to settle in Istanbul and go into the furniture trade. Within 36 hours of hearing this news, Mariam had arrived at her cousin's workshop and placed an order for some furniture, the color and style of which she had not discussed with anyone else. The agreement was as follows: the cousin's son, who had not yet received his first order, was going to give her a family discount, and Mariam was going to hand over her old sofas and a minimal payment. The thing neither side knew at the time was that Mariam was 3 weeks pregnant. This bit of knowledge was not as irrelevant to the situation as it might seem at first glance, for as it had been observed when she was With Mohammed, pregnancy made Mariam rather stubborn, quite apprehensive and a little bizarre. When the cousin's son had finished the sofa set, Mariam's pregnancy had progressed 2 months and was going strong. When the time came, she went to the workshop to see the finished work, looked at the color of the sofas and threw up. Egg yolk yellow. When even the thought of egg yolks was sufficient to make her feel like vomiting, it was out of question that the sofas she was going to put in the living room be egg yolk yellow. When the cousin's son tried to contain the situation by reminding her that it was she who had chosen this color, Mariam could not help throwing up again. She threw up so many times before noon that finally she got her way. The new agreement was as follows: the cousin's son, who had still not received his first order, was going to change the color of the upholstery, and in return, Mariam would give both her old sofas and more money than they had initially discussed. Mariam's pregnancy had reached its 3rd month when the cousin's son notified her that the sour cherry burgundy sofa set was ready. In the meantime, her morning sicknesses had considerably diminished. Now she instead suffered from schmaltziness. When the time came, she went to the workshop to see the completed work, looked at the color of the sofas and started to weep. Sour cherry burgundy. When even the image of a single sour cherry fallen from its tree was enough to remind her of untimely death, the possibility of the sofas in her living room being sour cherry burgundy could not be even brought up. When the cousin's son tried to defend himself and reminded her that she herself had chosen this color, Mariam could not help weeping again. That afternoon she cried so much that she finally got her way. The new agreement was as follows: the cousin's son, who had not yet received his first order, was going to change the color of the upholstery, and in return, Mariam would give both her old sofas and twice the money they had initially agreed upon. Only this time the most innocuous of all colors was going to be selected to guarantee customer satisfaction: aquamarine. It worked. 2 weeks later, when Mariam saw the aquamarine sofas, she neither vomited nor wept. That night the cousin's son slept peacefully for the first time in days. The following day, he threw the aquamarine sofa set in a pickup truck and brought it to flat number 1, Bonbon Palace, with 2 skinny porters he hired at the last minute, as his big and burly apprentice had suddenly been taken ill. Mariam had been waiting for them excitedly since early morning, with her ear on the doorbell and her hand on her not yet too swollen belly. In the fully crowded living room that was already small and had become almost impossible to walk around, with the arrival of the new sofas, the porters and the cousin's son jumped over the coffee tables and perched on whatever they could find to drink a cup of coffee to take away their tiredness. Then it was time to leave. The cousin's son put in his pocket the agreed fee and made each porter take a large piece of the old melon pink sofa set on their back, thus heading toward the door in a convoy. Unfortunately, they then had to stop abruptly before they could take even a single step. Such instances happen every so often on the road as well. You see the vehicle in front of you come to a sudden stop and know instantly that the road is jammed, but being unable to see what had happened ahead, you have no idea what the problem is and are forced to a standstill. The cousin's son and the porters, who were now doubled under the loads on their backs, were slightly more fortunate. Even though they did not know the whys and wherefores of the jam, they could see the immediate cause. Mariam stood at the threshold with element glitters in her eyes, her heavy frame and large belly, which seemed to have grown even more in the last few minutes, blocking the exit and not letting them pass. Her husband Musa was the first to grasp what Mariam's problem was. He drew to the side with silent resignation and started to fathom the course of Events. Musa had an ulcer of the stomach. Whenever he became irritated, his stomach started to burn sourly. So he had found the road to a serene life in accepting his wife as she was. He was particularly determined to avoid conflicts with her during her pregnancy. Yet, since he felt pity for the porters, he deemed they should at least be provided with some sort of explanation for the situation they were in. He began by saying simply, "She cannot give up her old sofas. She cannot, I know." In point of fact, this last "I know" was some sort of a forewarning. It was like suggesting, why don't you simply give up while you are ahead of the game? Yet neither the cousin's son nor the porters could get the message. Accordingly, they put the sofas down and started to argue forcefully. Their steadily swelling anger, however, did not do anything other than make Mariam embrace her cousin even more fiercely. The melon pink sofas were indeed worn out, but they had a common past with the family. The set had been bought when Mariam and Musa had finally moved out to their own house after spending 5 miserable years with the latter's mother and father. Mohammed's babyhood had been spent on them. The tiny pitch black hole at the corner of the double chair was a memento from the cigarette ashtray relative who had come to see the baby. That relative was no longer alive. Occasionally his scratchy voice smoked from the cigarette burn he had left behind. That is what the past was, that which you could not get rid of. The past did not resemble the crumbs spilled over a rug. You could not shake them out from open windows. "Well, in that case, we're taking these new ones back," said the cousin's son as he shouldered one of the aquamarine sofas. Taking his lead, the porters immediately reached for the other pieces of the set. Mariam looked at them with eyes filled with sheer sorrow, like a small child witnessing the lamb she had lovingly fed for days now being taken away to be slaughtered. For the following hour, the cousin's son and the porters tried to persuade her. In vain, the former furiously, the latter desperately, having now realized that they might not be paid in the end, since it could not be decided which sofas were to go and which to stay, all throughout the steadfastly flaring dispute. Everyone, except Musa, was left standing, which made them all, except Musa, even more likely to explode. Many times Mariam's eyes filled with tears, many times she felt nauseous. Considering her nausea, if not her tears, to be a message sent by the baby in her womb. "See?" she asked, joining her hands on top of her belly. Even this unborn innocent's heart is not willing to let go of the sofas. Joining her two skills to maximize power, she both cried and threw up so much that afternoon that by the end of the day the victory was Mariam's. The cousin's son was furious at himself for violating the oldest rule of trade history: never conduct business with relatives, and he and the porters, who were equally furious at him for his obvious failure, all left flat. Number 1, Bonbon Palace. Even though indubitably victorious, an unexpected problem awaited Mariam. How they were going to place 2 separate sofa sets and their coffee tables simultaneously inside the already narrow janitor's flat with its low ceiling was a challenge to the mind as well as being an eyesore, but Mariam would not give up. Making use of every square centimeter available, she managed to make 2 3-seated, 2 double-seated and 6 single-seated sofas fit into the 20-meter squared living room by lining them up like a wagon with the coffee tables placed in between. Hence the largest mistake Mohammed had committed this morning when declaring to his mother his intention to not go to school was to take refuge behind one of these furniture wagons. "You'll go whether you want to or not," Mariam said as she continued to push the sofas with one foot and started preparing her son's lunch. Once again she had made a toasted cheese sandwich with a slice of white cheese, a slice of tomato and 3 sprigs of parsley in between. Depending. On the day, she also put in a single fruit and just enough money, no more no less, to buy 1 bottle of buttermilk drink which Mohammed bought from the school canteen. Toasted cheese sandwiches were prepared at the school canteen too, and they were definitely much better and warmer than the homemade version, but even though he had told his mother over and over again not to prepare a toasted cheese sandwich, not once had he been able to make her listen to him. If only she could be prevented from putting the tomato in, and, if not that, at least the parsley, as he could not understand what that was doing there anyway. However, whenever Miriam had her mind set on something, oblivious to all stimuli pointing in the opposite direction, she would simply hide like a sea creature in the deaf silence of a cave, refusing to come out until the other side had totally given up. It was simply impossible for her to veer off from these things she had learned at who knows what stage of her life, that toasted cheese sandwiches, for example, were to be prepared with a slice of tomato and 3 sprigs of parsley. That is what she had been doing every morning for the last 5 months and 1 week, and today was no exception. Mohammed, however, felt as if it was not only this tomato and parsley that he carried to school every day, but also his mother's eye and ear. Should he ever not eat his sandwich or commit the much worse crime of skipping school, he somehow felt sure that this red eye of the tomato and green ear of the parsley would immediately break the news to his mother. Until school started, it was not with fear but with love that he took pieces of bread into his hands. In those days, the 2 noses of the breakfast bread belonged to him. As Miriam gave the noses to her son, she did not neglect to take off the small piece of paper attached to either one or the other of the noses. She told Mohammed that this notched piece of paper was a letter from the baker's daughter. The letter would be made to wait on the side until he had finished off his breakfast. Only then would Mohammed have gained the right to learn what was written in it. To that end, he would eat without any fuss. Even though he was forced to finish 1 boiled egg every morning, for the sake of reading the letter, he would complete his breakfast without a peep. And when the time came, Miriam took mischievous pleasure in clearing the table as slowly as possible to increase her son's curiosity, then poured herself a cup of tea and started to read, dissolving the words slowly in her mouth like a lump of sugar. The baker's daughter was a lonely child. She had no friends or siblings. While her father baked bread at night, she would sit alone in between the flour sacks and secretly write a letter to Mohammed. Her mother had died while she was still a baby and her father had remarried. The stepmother constantly tormented this tiny orphan because she had a stone instead of a heart. The poor girl escaped from the house at every opportunity to spend time at the bakery with her dear father. Sweet-smelling soft breads were prepared at the bakery, also crisp simmets. As Miriam kept reading these, it never occurred to Mohammed to wonder how so much information fitted onto a piece of paper that was only 1 times 3 centimeters squared. In the universe of not to 1 years, bread was sacred and every piece of paper with writing on it remained an absolute mystery, as the abstruse magic of the 2 men on the nose of the bread, the baker's daughter, would shimmer under a halo of sheer enchantment. Mohammed wanted to learn everything about her, what the bakery looked like, what she did there, if she liked to sleep in the morning and be up at night when all children her age had to go to bed early, the games she played, and, most of all, whether she was beautiful or not. Miriam described the girl as blonde and as delicate as a water lily that blooms in the water. She kept her hair long. It reached her waist on each side in 2 braids. Mohammed, too, had long hair then. Those who saw him on the street thought he was a girl. In her letters, the baker's daughter mostly talked about the people who stopped by the bakery all day long. Old people came, leaning on their canes. They dipped the hard biscuits they bought in their teas and dissolved them noisily in their toothless mouths. There were also the simmet sellers, who came early every morning with round wooden trays on their heads. The baker's daughter wanted to be friends with them, but some behaved rudely toward her and said impolite things. Still, there were some among them with hearts of gold. For instance, there was a freckled boy who could hop on one foot while whirling in each hand simmets put onto tooth-thin sticks. Mohammed was offended at the baker's daughter talking so frequently about the talents of this boy, but wouldn't object. Then there were the pastry sellers who stopped by with their hand carts. There were also women who came by to have pita bread made at the bakery. They treated the baker's daughter well. They would always give her a pita before carrying their heavy trays back home. The baker's daughter would write these things at length. Miriam would read them one by one. Time would flow by at a snail's pace. This halcyon innocence was going to be, however, roughly smashed to pieces in the fall, when Mohammed was registered to the 1G section of the neighborhood's only elementary school. First his hair was cut. Now nobody could say he looked like a girl. Then the breakfasts got shorter, and after some time, he learned how to read and write. It was then that he had discovered those tiny papers stuck on each bread were actually the labels of the bakeries, and there were no letters coming from the baker's blonde daughter. Since then, there were no more letters left to be read, nor that moon-faced girl to love. To learn to read was to lose forever the mystery of writing. "No way, I won't go," Mohammed yelled shrilly, unable to take his eyes off the lunch bag, but his voice was much weaker this time, and within a couple of minutes, when Miriam heard a crushed moan like that of a puppy, she knew her son had given up and stopped pushing the sofa. As he emerged from his corner crestfallen, Mohammed threw his mother a vinegary glance. Next to the huge frame of his mother, he was tiny like one of the dots on the letter O. When his sibling was born, he would be the other dot. Even though Mohammed was only 6 years old and knew all kids his age were smaller than their mothers, unlike other kids, he had long known and accepted that he would always be smaller than his mother no matter how much he grew up, whatever age he reached, whichever unattainable future he accomplished. His mother, with her wide forehead that wrinkled up when angry, her round face with rosy cheeks amassed, her huge hazel eyes that grew wide when stubborn, her breasts swollen like balloons, her dimpled arms, her chubby flesh bulging from her thighs, her feet as big as a child's grave, and her endless superstitious beliefs and unbelievable energy were all so big as to totally crush every obstacle into dust, and would always remain so. Hence he put his toasted sandwich with parsley into his lunch bag, stepped on the flattened corpse of the cockroach he had crushed just this morning at the corner of the aquamarine double chair, and, dragging his feet, set out on his way to school.